Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the fanfiction guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Was Hawk's Little Brother? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya Izuku was generally a happy kid. He had just gotten his quirk, which let him breathe green fire and control it. It could burn other people, even his dad, who was fireproof. What fascinating implications, but not himself or inanimate objects. It was a quirk perfect for hero work, with no possibility of property damage, which was a huge, if a largely unnoticed issue in heroics. Then the trouble started. About a month after he got his quirk, his father had to spend 2 weeks in America to go to some work thing that Izuku, being 4 years old, didn't understand, so it was just him and his mom. During that time, Izuku had many playdates with Kaken as usual. Izuku adored Kaken. They were best friends, and they were gonna be heroes together. Kaken had been even more impressed than his parents when Izuku showed him his quirk. On the walk home from one such playdate, it was late at night and they were walking along an empty road, with only a nearby street lamp to guide their way. His mother, upsettingly enough, seemed more on edge than usual. Soon, Izuku found out why. A man stepped out of the shadows of a nearby alleyway, a knife glinting in his hand. He smiled, baring his teeth at the two of them, and his eyes were dangerously gleeful. There were rough patches of hair all over his jawline, likely an attempt to grow a beard. Or perhaps he simply hadn't had access to shaving tools. His mother jerked away, shoving Izuku behind her as the man cackled and crept closer. Izuku could feel his mother shivering while he held onto her skirt behind her. His mother worried a lot, and he didn't like it. He absolutely hated it when she was really scared, which he hadn't seen often. This time, however, he had a quirk. This time he could help. So, as the man raised his knife and started to speak, Izuku bravely let go of his mother's skirt and stepped in front of her. "Stop it," he said, and he opened his mouth wide as a blazing inferno green flames, more than he had ever created before, poured out directly at the man. The man stopped smiling. He froze for a second or two before sprinting away. He wasn't able to escape all of the fire, but he managed to get away only slightly singed. Izuku would later come to regard him as a coward. Izuku felt unusually cold, and his flames hovered about him without anything to do. He started to shiver even as he dragged his fire closer to warm him up. There was no effect. He stared at his flames, trying to figure out the issue. He wondered. He drew in a big breath, and as he did so the fire swirled around him and into his mouth until there was nothing left but him and his mother. He no longer felt cold. His quirk must be tied to his body heat in some way, then. Perhaps that was what his fire was made from. He had always been hotter than everyone else. It was at this point that Izuku looked over and noticed his mother gaping at him, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy!" That seemed to snap her out of her stupor. "Oh, my baby, are you all right?" They must not have been as alone as they thought, as a voice from across the street cut her off. My, you must be a strong young hero, little man." A man in a black trench coat was walking across the street. He had black hair and brown eyes, with no obvious mutation quirk. "I couldn't help but notice the way you stood up to that mugger just now," he continued. "Your quirk must be so strong. What is it?" Midoriya puffed up his chest, pleased with the man's words. He opened his mouth to answer his question, but his mother cut him off before he could. "I'm sorry, who are you?" she asked. Izuku paused. It was a fair question. After all, they had just been attacked. If this guy had seen Izuku scare the mugger away, he was either in cahoots with the mugger or had just watched while it happened. "Nakamura Ito. Sorry I didn't rush in to help. I was just wowed by this little kid's strength. What's your name, kid?" He looked down at Izuku with a bright, charismatic smile. Years later, Izuku would learn not to trust such friendly expressions. Charisma could be extraordinarily dangerous and manipulative. But at the time, Izuku was only 4, and he didn't know that a smile could be such a duplicitous little thing. So, before his mother could stop him, he puffed up his chest again and answered, confidently, "Midoriya Izuku, sir." It would ultimately be that moment that ruined him, that made him so easy to find later on. Without any further prompting, he said, "My quirk lets me breathe green fire. It seems to affect my body heat though. I just got it last month." The man's eyes widened and he leaned back in exaggerated surprise and amazement even as his mother gripped his arm and quietly whispered, "Don't say anything else, Izuku. Let me handle this." "Sir, my son and I have to go to the police station to report what just happened. I'm afraid we have to leave now." With that, she started to drag Izuku away from the man who, as he was beginning to realize, asked too many questions too insistently, as opposed to helping them recover from nearly being mugged. "I could escort why? We should be fine, thank you." She jerked on Izuku's arm a little more forcefully than she had likely intended in her haste to get away. Izuku didn't mind. He didn't think he liked the man after all. -0. Their time at the police station reporting the incident lasted well into the night, and Izuku woke up late for school the following morning, which threw their usual schedule out the window. They scrambled to find his clothes and his backpack, to make and eat breakfast, to try and unsuccessfully tame his perpetually unruly hair. Hisashi had always been the one to read the newspaper, so Inko simply gave the front headline detailing one of All Might's fights a cursory glance before moving on. She much preferred watching the news on television, anyway. Perhaps if she had had time to watch the news that morning, or flipped a few pages into the paper, she would have seen the article detailing what a strong little hero Izuku was, embellishing certain parts of the encounter to make the event seem more interesting and newsworthy. Perhaps if she had, she would have felt uneasy at having her son's full name in the news for all to see, details about his quirk included, nothing about it kept private. Perhaps if she had, she would have noticed the article was written by one Nakamura Ito, a reporter known to blow up small events out of proportion. As it stood, she saw nothing of it, and, having never seen the strange man again, thought she had successfully avoided a possible catastrophe. -0. The effects weren't immediate. Izuku told some friends at school what he had done the night before, and had no way of knowing that some of his classmates were asking for details not because they learned of the incident from those Izuku had told, but from hearing the news that morning. Kaken seemed angry in his own way that simultaneously expressed frustration that he was not the one who had fought off a villain, and pride that he was friends with the one who had been. He was a mystery not many could understand. That day Izuku went home and told his mother about all the kids who had been impressed with him at school. His mother ended up sitting him down to give him a talk, though it was clear he wasn't in trouble. "Izuku," she started, "what you did last night was very brave, and I'm so proud of you. You'll make an excellent hero. But honey, there are laws. And you can't break them. Since you got your quirk so recently, the police let it slide this time, but you absolutely must not use your quirk in public again. It's against the law, and there are consequences when you break the law." She spoke slowly so that her son hung onto and heard and internalized every word. She gently gestured with her hands, hoping to keep his attention on her. "When strangers start asking you questions and you don't know where they came from, always check with an adult to make sure that the stranger is safe before you answer, okay?" She had wanted to have this conversation last night, but they had gotten home so late. Then they had no time this morning, so she had to wait until Izuku got back from school. "Okay." Izuku was cheerful, happy to do as his mother had asked. His mother dismissed him, and he ran off to go play with Kaken in the park down the street. -0. The next day marked exactly 1 week since Hisashi had been gone. It was Sunday, so Inko and Izuku were sleeping in. It was about 7 o'clock when there was a banging at their door. "Child Protective Services, open up." The banging continued. Inko startled awake and rushed to the front door. Her son was standing in the doorway of his room rubbing his eyes sleepily when she reached the hallway. "Mommy? What's happening?" "Go to your room, Izuku, and don't come out until I tell you to. This is very important. I need you to do exactly as I say." His eyes widened and he seemed to wake up a little. He nodded and hurried back into his room, closing the door behind him. The banging was still going, and Inko raced to open the door. "What's this?" Before she could finish her question, a man wearing a bulletproof vest shoved his way inside, knocking Inko over. He proceeded to walk down the hallway and search the living room and the kitchen. A woman in a nice dress skirt and blouse walked in after him, stopping in front of Inko. She made no move to help her up. "Where's your son, ma'am? Why are you asking? Why are you here?" Inko had never felt this scared before. Even as she asked her questions, she knew the answer. They were here to take her son away, and she had no idea why. "You've been found negligent by the state, and we are here to remove Izuku from your care." Her voice was monotone, and she seemed almost bored with the situation. Inko was stuck on the word negligent. Why did they think she was negligent? If anything, she was overprotective, and anyone who knew her knew this. So why? "Ma'am, I need you to tell me where your son is." Even as she spoke, the man who had been wandering the house saw the door with the All Might plaque that had Izuku's name on it. He started to walk towards his room with more purpose than he had before. The woman had stopped to watch him, as had Inko. He opened the door, and not a few seconds later they heard Izuku screaming. "Let me go! Let me go! I don't want to leave, let me go!" He was banging his arms against the man's grip, to no avail. Inko scrambled to her son and started trying to pull her son away from the man, but his hold was strong. They were both screaming each other's names, tears streaming down their faces. "Mommy! Mommy! Izuku, Izuku no!" They were dragged out into the hallway where another man in a bulletproof vest was waiting. He grabbed Inko and pulled her away from her son, holding her in place until the two that had come in and her son were out of sight. Then he let her go and walked after them. Inko fell to her knees and sobbed. She could still hear her son screaming for her as he was dragged down the stairs. Neighbors were standing in their doors watching the commotion. Inko didn't care. She wanted her son back. -0. Izuku was shoved into the booster seat in the back of a nondescript black car, still crying his heart out. He didn't even notice the car start moving, he didn't notice it stop, either. He did, however, notice the car door next to him open, and he leaned away as much as his seat would allow. He screamed, "I want my mommy," and proceeded to cry harder. He heard a sigh, and someone began to unbuckle him. "Look, kid, we're home." Izuku tried to look, but he couldn't see very well. There were too many tears in his eyes. Someone picked him up again, and he was carried to what seemed like a very nice and very big building. He was beginning to run out of tears to cry and found himself very thirsty as his sobs turned to sniffles. He was carried into the building and bright lights assaulted his eyes just as his vision began to clear, blinding him again. He was carried a little further before he stopped. His vision finally returned and he saw that they were waiting in front of an elevator. When it finally opened, he was taken inside. There wasn't any music and no one spoke, so it was eerily silent except for his sniffling. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to what looked like a massive living room. There was a circle of flooring a few feet in front of him that was a step lower than the rest. It had deep red couches, a TV on a dark wooden TV stand, and a dark coffee table with a small plant on it. Beyond that, there was a kitchenette in the far left corner that was generally white with lime green accents. To the right of that was a circular dining table with enough chairs to seat 5. There was a light hanging from the ceiling above it. Floor-to-ceiling windows adorned the far wall. There were 2 doors on the left wall and 3 on the right. They were evenly spaced, and there were little plaques next to each of them. He was plopped down next to a door on the left, with a plaque that read, "Netsu Izuku." The door was opened, and he was shoved inside. "This is your room," a gruff voice behind him said. "Get used to it." With that, the door slammed behind him. Izuku stood there for a moment, not really thinking anything. Not seeing anything either. When he finally centered himself, he examined the room. It was bigger than his one at home, even if it was a bit bare. There was a window with dark green curtains on the far wall, a bed with a nightstand and a dark green bedspread in the far left corner, a desk in the far right, and a dresser next to that. A chest lay at the foot of his bed, and a bookshelf was next to the door. He went to his nightstand and struggled to turn on the lamp on top of it. When he did, he turned around and opened the dresser. It was full of clothes organized into drawers. They all seemed to fit him too. He noticed none of it was All Might merch. Looking at the bookshelf, he saw that there were 5 shelves, though the top 3 were bare. The bottom shelf had children's books, and above that, there were notebooks and textbooks. Opening the chest, he found a few various toys, with only one All Might action figure. Before he could cry about missing his old room and his mother, there was a small knock on his door. He flinched away, remembering what happened the last time he heard a knock. "Hello? Is someone in there?" I saw they finally put a name on the plaque. The voice was young, though not as young as Izuku. Hesitantly, he opened the door. There was a boy about twice his height, maybe taller, with blonde hair and golden eyes. He had an easygoing smile and his posture was laid back. "Hi, I'm Takami Kigo. I'm in the room next to yours. In which Izuku gets into you." Izuku woke, as he usually did, to the sound of his alarm at 6 o'clock in the morning. He groaned, reaching across his bed to turn it off. He lay there in the silence with his eyes open for a moment, before groaning again and rolling out of bed and walking over to his dresser to get whatever clothes he would wear for the day. His room hadn't changed much in the last decade. His bookcase was now full, 3 whole shelves dedicated to his quirk analysis notebooks. The toys in his chest were replaced with various mementos and trinkets. A button from his old favorite shirt, his only All Might action figure after the HPSC took him in, and every blanket he was ever allowed to own. His desk now had a bit of clutter, including a picture of him and Kigo on one of their rare off days a couple of years back. He was never given a frame for it, so it just sat taped to the wall. Once he had put on a black athletic shirt, matching shorts, and red sneakers, he headed down to the training room on the floor below, being sure to take his phone and earbuds with him. It was a pretty nondescript place. It was almost twice as big as the entire living room upstairs, with an indoor track around it and an area in the center reserved for sparring. He jogged 5 laps before doing his various stretches. Then he began his workout in earnest. Izuku both loved and hated his morning routine. On one hand, none of the suits, as he creatively called the HPSC workers, bothered him during this time. He enjoyed the burn of his muscles and listening to loud music as he woke up. On the other, he didn't like being required to do it by people who only knew his name because they had read it on some government document or another. He had long since learned to put that particular complaint to the side and ignore it, however. All right, I want you to try blowing out as much of your fire as you can. The woman looked at him expectantly. Izuku was only 6. Izuku couldn't even remember what she had looked like. She wore her hair up like all the others. She wore a suit like all the others. She rarely smiled, always looking for more from him, just like all the others. His trainers changed from week to week, and he had trouble distinguishing one from the next. He had stopped trying to learn their names a month after he had started training. When he hesitated to fulfill her request, she spoke again, more forcefully this time. "I need you to create as much fire as you can." It was something they had started to ask him to do often, and he always hated it. He always became so unbearably cold. He would fall and shiver, and he was sure his lips turned blue. Nonetheless, he took a deep breath and let it out. Massive green flames poured from his mouth, filling the room. He confined it to the corner so it wouldn't burn any of the adults in the room. When he was done, he noted that there was more fire than he had ever produced before. He was also still able to stand, which was new. He looked to the woman, who was noting something down on her clipboard. When she was finished, she looked up and nodded. "Now, I want you to see if you can extinguish the flames." Izuku stared. He needed those flames. He was so cold, and those flames were the only way of getting warm again. He opened his mouth to protest, but she fixed him with an icy glare. Reluctantly, he let go of his hold on his fire, on his warmth, and it disappeared. Today was the big day, the day he had supposedly been training for nearly 10 years. Today was the day of the UA recommended exam. At 7:15 on the button, he finished his workout and cooled down with some static stretches. He went upstairs and took a shower, getting dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt while packing another set of athletic wear in a duffel bag. When he finally stepped out of the bathroom, he recognized Mara of all people waiting for him. "Mara-san? What are you doing here?" The man, who had been browsing his phone while lounging on the couch, looked up. "I thought you were the smart one." Izuku blinked. Mara sighed. I'm the one they sent to take you to your exam. Come on, Netsu. -0. So this is the new kid you picked out? Izuku was 8, and he had been summoned to the training room. He found it interesting that he was still considered new, since he had been here for 4 years. He missed his mom. The man before him looked a bit more unkempt than the rest of the suits. His blonde hair was a chin-length bedraggled mess, and he had faint eye bags underneath his eyes. The man went on to say, "He doesn't look like much. You said he was in the news when he was 4? The woman Izuku had come to think of as being in charge, whose name he had yet to learn, looked slightly irritated. Yes, Mara, he stopped mugging only a month after he got his quirk, and his skill has improved by leaps and bounds since we acquired him. Izuku had to resist the urge not to cringe. He hated it when they spoke about him like he wasn't there. He hated it even more when they spoke as if he wasn't even a person. Mara glanced at him once more, eyes furrowed as if he didn't really believe her. What's his name again? The woman in charge answered for him. Netsu Izuku. Izuku had to bite his tongue to keep from speaking out of turn. That wasn't his name. It was the name they gave him when they took him, but he didn't accept it as his. -0. What really frustrated Izuku was that he couldn't remember his actual last name. It was always on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't quite recall it. Nonetheless, he nodded and followed Mara into the elevator, duffel bag in hand. The doors closed, and neither of them spoke on the journey down. Mara was tapping away on his phone, and Izuku tapped his fingers against his leg. Izuku didn't have a chance to go outside as much as he wanted to. He always had training or schoolwork to do, and it was difficult to justify a pointless excursion to the HPSC. Things had become even more suffocating since Kigo left 4 years ago. Izuku got to visit his agency every now and again, but he still missed him. At last, the elevator dinged, and Izuku and Mara headed to a black car with tinted windows outside. Izuku climbed into the back seat and Mara followed him after saying something to the driver. The whole ride to Ua, Izuku looked out the window, and Mara looked at his phone. At one point, he even answered a call Izuku pretended not to listen to. It had something to do with budgets for the provisional license exams this year. Eventually, the car began to slow. They had reached their destination. Izuku looked at the ridiculously massive gates in front of Ua. They were almost extravagant and definitely a display of power. -0. I would like to go to UA to complete my education. The director paused, her eyebrows raised. Izuku was 12 and had been gathering up the courage to ask for weeks. His time with the HPSC had sapped his desire to be a hero, but he didn't have a choice in the matter. He had decided that if he was going to be a hero anyway, he would try to do it the way he had dreamed of doing it as a kid. Why would you want such a thing? Do you find our training insufficient? Izuku's eyes widened. This was why he had been scared to ask. Anything not in line with what they had planned for him was considered disobedience, and Izuku was terrified of being considered disobedient. I know. I've been able to improve so much thanks to your guidance. Hawks just debuted, and he's already so popular. Izuku took a breath. This was the hard part. However, the point of only having the two of us recruited so far is to see how best to train us. Wouldn't it be best to train us differently to see which way works best? Izuku did his best to fix his features into something neutral, complacent. The director looked at him in consideration. We'll keep it under consideration. -0. Mara began to exit the back seat and looked back at Izuku impatiently when he didn't immediately follow. When he did, Mara handed him a yellow badge and put on one of his own. The two walked across the courtyard of sorts and entered the building, where Mara began guiding him to the testing area, having yet to say a word since they had left. When they reached their destination, Izuku found himself in a medium-sized room, half of which was filled with desks and chairs with tests sitting unopened on top of them. The other side was bare, and a few people were standing there. As the two walked over, Izuku recognized 4 members of UA staff. He identified them as Blood King, Present Mike, and Nedzu, the principal of UA. Izuku didn't immediately recognize the last individual. He must have been an underground hero. He also noted the presence of the number 2 hero and what must have been his son, as well as a tall bald kid glaring at them both. There were also two girls with dark hair, one in a stylized ponytail, and a boy with an interesting facial mutation. There were a few other kids, too, but Izuku didn't have time to analyze them before the principal. "Welcome to UA, everybody. I'm Nedzu, the principal." He said the last word with extra cheer. Izuku thought his smile was somewhat eerie. "Am I a bear, a dog, a mouse, who knows? Remember, we will only be giving spots to the top 6 performances today, so do your best. I wish you all luck." Apparently having nothing more to say, the animal walked out, and Present Mike came a little more alive. He began to give instructions for where everyone should be sitting and guided the sponsors to a neighboring room. The written exam had been fairly easy and was divided into sections by subject. He had been staying up a little later to study each night, and it looked like the effort had paid off. He only finished first in the quirk study portion, however, and he found himself slightly irked by this fact. Looking over, he saw that the girl with the ponytail consistently finished quicker than him, especially for the science portion. Perhaps her quirk had something to do with it. Still, no one could beat him at quirk analysis. -0. What's this? The suit grabbed the notebook that he had been writing in out of his hands and began to flip through it, eyes widening as he did so. Izuku, for his part, had tried to hide his hobby from the HPSC, for fear that they would stop him from continuing to do it. And now it was all ruined by a suit sneaking up on him when he thought he was alone. How had not heard the elevator ding? The suit continued to flip through the notebook, looking more and more excited. "You did all these on your own?" 10-year-old Izuku could only nod. He was surprised. Of all the reactions he had expected, amazement wasn't one of them. Perhaps they would let him keep his hobby. The suit's expression turned thoughtful. "All right, I'll talk to the director about adding this to your studies. Your analysis is skillful, but it needs refinement." -0. Not much happened during that portion of the exam. Present Mike would occasionally walk around to make sure no one cheated, while the other two teachers quietly conversed at the front of the room. They weren't loud enough for Midoriya to hear them. Every time he was waiting for the other examinees to finish their test, he tried to identify the underground hero. He knew he had seen him before, but he just couldn't figure out who he was. Perhaps if Izuku knew his quirk. He still hadn't been able to determine who the last man was before it was time for the practical exam. They were all directed to the locker room, where Izuku changed into an outfit identical to the one he had worn earlier that morning. When he walked outside, he took a moment to breathe in the fresh air, leaning against a wall with his eyes closed to take in the sun. When everyone had come out, Present Mike stopped to explain the rules. They would go in groups of 6 to complete a 3-kilometer obstacle course. They could use their quirks however they wanted, but they could not sabotage their competitors. Izuku was in the first group with Endeavor's son, who he was beginning to realize was disturbingly withdrawn, bald kid, and 3 other people he hadn't taken notice of before. While waiting to start their obstacle course, Izuku saw the bald kid single out and start bothering Endeavor's son, screaming something about passion, then have a bad reaction to being brushed off. He backed away, clearly angry at the response he got. He looked over at Izuku, frowned, and started to walk towards him. Izuku just managed to keep from rolling his eyes. Before the kid reached him, however, Present Mike shouted, "Go!" and everyone surged forward. Baldy and Endeavor 2.0 lead the pack, taking an absurd lead. Izuku paid no attention, instead blowing out some of his heat and feeling a familiar chill, wrapping it around his forearms and calves. He wasn't quite sure why it made him stronger in those areas, but it did. He had a few theories. Maybe his body just responded well to heat. Maybe his fire was plain magical. He didn't know, and now was not the time for him to ponder it. A trick Kigo had taught him for running fast was not to focus on moving his legs quickly, but instead to focus on pumping his arms. His legs would follow the motion, and he wouldn't feel as tired until he finished running. A quick glance behind him showed that one of the kids behind him wasn't even using their quirk. Another had a strength enhancer that they didn't seem to know how to use creatively, and the last had a speed quirk that was catching up to him. Izuku accelerated a bit more. The others wouldn't be a threat, it would be the other 2 that had a chance of beating him. For a school famous for innovation, The obstacles weren't very inventive. There were swinging mallets that would knock you off a balance beam. He jumped on top of the mallets, so he only had to avoid the beams suspending them. There was a large spike pit. He just slid across the ice trail Endeavor's kid left, and what essentially amounted to a massive cliff face they had to climb. He was able to slowly fly himself upwards. His quirk mostly just got him airborne rather than allowing him to fly, but if he could apply himself, he could manage to slowly levitate. He wound up in third place, just a few yards away from Endeavor Jr. and Mr. Passionate. After he had finished his exam, he had to stay for the interview portion, which the HPSC had trained him for. He was allowed to leave immediately afterwards since he had finished his exam, and Mara ushered him back to the car after he had changed again and packed up his stuff. The drive back to the HPSC building seemed to take longer than the trip to UA. Izuku spent the next 2.5 weeks agonizing over whether or not he got in. He was fairly certain he did well enough on the written portion, but he had come in third for his practical, and that was just one round of several. His wait came to an end when a suit walked in while he was doing homework in the living room and told him he got in, and that school would start in a month. They went on to say that he wouldn't have to do any paperwork and that the HPSC would handle it. When the suit walked back out, Izuku sat frozen for a minute. He got in. He got in. -0. Izuku stood in front of the gates of UA again, this time in a UA uniform he had been handed a week prior. He had long since given up on any notion of going to UA since he was taken from his mother, but here he was. He wondered if Kaken got in, and if so, if he would recognize him if and when he saw him. He honestly didn't know. He remembered what he had looked like when he was 4, but he may look completely different now. It had been years. Izuku took a deep breath and started to navigate to his class. He had been told to go to 1A, which he had seen on his way to take the written portion test. When he got there, he only saw a few others there, including Endeavor's kid, the ponytail girl that kept finishing quicker than him, and someone else he didn't recognize. He had dark blue hair and square glasses. His posture was cartoonishly rigid. When he noticed Izuku, he started to march up to him and said, "Greetings. I am Ida Tenya from Semi-Private Academy. I see we're in the same class. What's your name?" Izuku started to lean away. He was so, not forceful, but he had that kind of presence around him. "Izuku. Homeschooled." Ida gave a curt nod and, perhaps seeing his stress, went back to his seat. Izuku looked at the board and saw a seating chart. He found his name and took his seat by the window. He hunched down a little and looked outside while he waited for class to begin. About 15 minutes passed by, with the kid who approached him greeting everyone who came in. Izuku was just starting to zone out when there was an abrupt shouting by the doorway. "Get the F away, extra." There was something that sounded suspiciously like growling, and when Izuku looked over, there was a kid with spiky blonde lumbering over towards Izuku, before taking the desk in front of him. It was Kaken. He looked just the same as when they were kids. He looked over at Izuku, sneering and ready to say something when he stopped. His eyes were wide as dinner plates, and Izuku was sure his were the same. "Izuku! In which we catch up with Bluth." Katsuki remembered more than most kids his age would have. The clearest picture in his mind was his mother hanging up the phone in tears as she explained to her 4-year-old son that there were people who thought Auntie was a bad mother and that because of this fact, they had taken Izuku far away. At first, he had been confused. Auntie was an even better mother than his own. Why did someone think she wasn't? Did this mean he would be taken away too? As much as he claimed to hate his mother, he didn't want to leave her. He had never seen his mother cry before or since. The next picture he remembered with absolute clarity was Auntie and Uncle on their couch signing packets of papers with all of the Bakugas, including Katsuki, present. There had been whispers of the word divorce for months before that point, but Katsuki had waved all of his concerns away. Izuku would need both his parents when they got him back. Then it was done, and Katsuki never saw Uncle again. That was when it really settled in his mind that Izuku wasn't coming back. Looking back on it years after the fact, he could guess at what had actually happened. The sad truth of it all was that the two had grieved differently. For 2 years after Izuku was taken, they had both gone in search of him in the courtrooms with a dogged determination. After all that time banging their head against the wall only to confirm that Izuku wasn't even in foster care, Uncle had gotten tired and wanted to move on. Auntie didn't. Perhaps she couldn't. It was at that point that Uncle went to stay in America. 2 years later, the papers were signed. Everything else was somewhat fuzzy for him. He remembered picking Uncle up from the airport to drive him home less than a week after the incident. He remembered endless days sitting around the Midoriya family dining table sipping tea and everyone making empty promises to get him back that never seemed to comfort anyone. He remembered the extras at school forgetting Izuku after a month or two. He had vague memories of the first lawyer, too full of sympathy and his pockets too empty to be reasonable. The second lawyer was more horrified, confident, and cheap. They seemed to lose heart after 6 months of being unable to even locate Izuku. After that, the Midoriyas went through lawyers like candy. Katsuki didn't like any of them. Katsuki also didn't like his classmates. None of them ever acknowledged him, they only seemed to acknowledge his quirk. It was his quirk they would praise, his quirk that would be a hero, and his quirk they would follow around. He often wondered if Izuku had ever had to deal with it, or if it was just him. Was his own self, his own personality, too weak to be a hero, too weak to admire? Was the reason everyone only ever admired his quirk for being strong because there was nothing strong about himself? Nothing fit for hero work? So he took steps to make himself stronger. He got angrier, meaner, and scarier. He perfected his control over his quirk and his ability to fly with it. After an incident where he flew too far off the handle and swung his arm to gesticulate and ended up socking an extra in the nose without the teacher seeming to care, he got more violent too. He would make these extras see him and not his quirk. Because of these efforts, he never really made close friends with anyone like he had with that DMN nerd. Despite these efforts, he vowed to be the best hero in the world since Izuku no longer could, and he promised he would get Izuku back when he did. This he did alone in his bedroom one night when he was 8 years old, looking up at a blank ceiling swathed in minimally charred bedding. His quirk still had a nasty habit of going off in his sleep if he rubbed his hands too quickly against his sheets. -0. A new hero going by the name Hawks made a stunning debut today, saving no less than 76 people from a burning building, all while fighting a villain outside. Here with us tonight is a quirk expert to give us a rundown on what the capabilities of his quirk may be. A pretty blonde woman sat at a glass table with a guest who was likely the quirk expert she mentioned. 10-year-old Katsuki was only half listening to the news as he devoured his extra spicy curry. Tonight was Saturday night, and he had a new idea involving a more focused explosion to cut through denser material. He wasn't quite sure what to call it yet. He was debating between something like armor piercer and explosive murder rage. He was leaning towards the latter so far. Thank you for having me, Nakamura-san. Now, just looking at these pictures, it's obvious that his quirk manifests in the form of his wings. We can see that he can use them to fly, and can also detach feathers at will and still maintain control of them afterward. Using too many seems to inhibit his ability to fly, though, as we can see from this clip here. A corresponding clip played as Katsuki finished his curry. He moved to get into some more athletic wear. He turned off the TV just as he began explaining the way he used some of the bigger feathers from his wings as swords that he could fight with. What did Katsuki care if some new fucker debuted? He was just another extra Katsuki would beat when he graduated top of his class at UA. This guy sure as hell wouldn't help him get Izuku back. Katsuki left to go train. -0. Katsuki huffed a breath as a bunch of extras were visibly put off by the extravagance of UA. The fuckers wouldn't last long if they were surprised by a DMN gate. He marched straight past them as he headed for the testing area. This was the first big step to getting Izuku back, and he'd be dead if he let some extra stop him now. When he finally found the ridiculously massive auditorium, he saw President Mike and the famed principal of UA, the rat with an intelligence quirk, Nedzu. He sat down. Principal Nedzu said some welcoming words Katsuki didn't bother to listen to before leaving, and took the written test. He had aced the mock exam, and he was sure he had done even better on the actual test. When President Mike explained how the practical would work, some fucker stood up and interrupted him, insulting UA for poor printouts, and didn't sit down until he was corrected. Katsuki was fairly certain he had the pretentious but pegged. When they were finally released to beat up some robots, he practically booked it to the shuttle that would take him to his testing ground. When he got there, some of the extras looked surprised that it was the size of an entire city. Katsuki wasn't. There were many reasons he would be going to UA, not least of which were their abundance of resources to train him. He had done his research. Present Mike gave a countdown, and Katsuki launched himself forward with his quirk before the doors were even fully open. He landed on a three-pointer, placing his hands on his neck briefly while keeping his quirk activated until the head came off. He launched himself off the body before it fell and flew towards the other side of the city. He downed any three-pointers he came across and the occasional two-pointer in a similar way to the first one until he found a fairly isolated area. Once there, he wreaked swathes of destruction, destroying all robots he laid eyes on without any competition. He occasionally saw another examinee out of the corner of his eye, but they all scurried away as soon as they noticed him. He flew down street after street, laying waste to every villain he saw. About 5 streets in he heard a deafening rumbling as an absolutely giant robot appeared out of the ground a few miles away. It was marked with a large 0. Katsuki was behind it and safely out of its path, so he just kept on obliterating robot after robot, gathering what he counted to be around 75 points before a massive buzzer went off and all the robots turned off. He deactivated his quirk, much of his sweat blissfully gone. Katsuki rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck before making his way to the exit. On his way, he saw an old lady with an unnatural mouth go around kissing people. He saw that she was healing injuries and that must have been her quirk. Seeing as he wasn't so weak as to get injured during an exam, he continued, completely ignoring her. He spent the next couple weeks waiting for his acceptance letter and training harder than ever. "I'll find you Izuku. -0. Hey brat. Get down here. Leave me alone, you effing hag. Don't talk to me that way. Your letter's here, so come down and get it you little bee. Honey, could we perhaps tone it down a bit? Katsuki. Get your fat butt down here." A beleaguered sigh came from the corner. "Goddamn it, I'm coming, you old hag. What did you just call me, you little sheet? -0. Young man, you should be very pleased with yourself. You came in first for the practical exam, with a total of 77 villain points. That makes you your year's student representative. You also performed extraordinarily well on the written exam. I am happy to welcome you to your hero academia. Congratulations on being accepted into UA. Details about the next steps in the enrollment process are in the paper that came in the same envelope as this message. I look forward to teaching you this year." Katsuki was surprised All Might would be teaching him. He hadn't heard that yet. -0. Did you get in? Course I did, ya old hag. I'm sure Izuku would be proud of you. He'll be even more proud when I become number 1. -0. Like at the entrance exam, Katsuki didn't hesitate at the gates into UA, instead opting to march straight to his destination. When he got to the door of Class 1A, could hear the chattering of what must have been the extras who would be his classmates. He would have to arrive earlier in future to stay ahead. He opened the door and was immediately ambushed by some fucker with dark blue hair and rectangular glasses. It was the asshat who had interrupted Present Mike before the practical exam. His uniform was neatly pressed and perfectly following the dress code, his tie perfectly centered. He started making hand-chopping gestures as he spoke. "Greetings. I am Ida Tenya from Sumai." He leaned in way too close for comfort. "Get the F away extra." He finally backed off, looking completely affronted at having been talked back to. That is no way to speak to a classmate. You are representing UA High School, one of the most prestigious schools in the nation, and you will be expected to act like it. Katsuki didn't even let him finish before shoving past the pretentious fucker. He decided to call him Glasses. He had already forgotten what his real name was. Glasses gaped at him as Katsuki took in the seating chart on the board while flat out ignoring him. The hand-chopping motions spread to include both hands as he continued his lecture. Katsuki had stopped listening a while ago, even as eyes began to turn in his direction. Wasn't his fault some a-hole invaded his personal space. He made his way to his seat by the window and noticed some motherfucker openly gawking at him. He turned to tell him to F off too when he saw his hair and realized just who he was. What bothered him most was how closed off he seemed. The nerd he had known was always so annoyingly bright and cheerful, if quick to cry. He fell down and burst into tears more times than he could count, but always got back up again with a kind word to say to everyone. This kid had bags under his eyes, his posture was hunched and defensive, his eyes only slightly wide, closed off from the world. He looked so much like he remembered, and yet nothing like it at all. His name slipped off his tongue before he could stop it. Izuku. In which Aizawa makes an appearance. Izuku. Their exchange had garnered the attention of most of the classroom, and a moment of stillness fell over the room as the two stared at each other. The moment didn't last long, however, because, at that moment, a man who looked unsettlingly like a caterpillar crawled in while inside a bright yellow sleeping bag. He wormed his way over to the podium before standing up, shedding his sleeping bag, and said, "If you're all here to just stand around, you can go ahead and leave now." He had long black hair and dark clothes to match, as well as an impressively long scarf wrapped around his neck. There were gruff patches of hair along his jawline and yellow goggles hanging around his neck. Students scrambled to their seats at his appearance, backs straight and eyes wide. It took you 8 seconds to get in place. You're not a very logical class, are you? He proceeded to drop a pile of gym clothes from a previously unnoticed bag he was holding and said, "Put these on and meet me on the grounds in 8 minutes. Anyone late will be expelled." Then he just walked out. Everyone stayed still for a beat, it was becoming a habit, before rushing to find a set of clothes to fit them before hurrying after their teacher in the hopes of getting directions to the nearest locker room. Izuku idled by his desk waiting for the crowd to thin while Kaken had started going for his clothes before anyone else in the class even moved. Kaken ended up leaving the room first, with Izuku close behind, following the others in a slight jog. The HPSC hadn't given him a map or anything, so he just followed the crowd, hoping to conserve his energy for whatever they would be doing out on the grounds. Someone must have known where to go, because they found the changing rooms relatively quickly, and everyone changed as quickly as they could before dashing out to the field. Izuku was the 5th one there, with Kaken, the 2 from the recommended exam, and Ida having beaten him there. Kaken looked ticked about not having had a chance to corner Izuku. Izuku looked out at the field and found himself slightly underwhelmed. It was a massive field of green with a sandbox for long jump, a ball throw area, and a 400-meter track. There were vast stretches of land beyond that, with a wooded area slightly further. While the size was unusually large from what Izuku could tell, it wasn't nearly as extravagant as he had been expecting. So far, the only truly grandiose thing he had seen was the gate and exterior of the main building. He was beginning to wonder whether what he had heard about the school was true. Still, being outside, Izuku wasn't complaining. He closed his eyes and breathed in deep. He could smell freshly mown grass, and he loved it. He relished the feeling of the breeze in his hair and the sun in his face. Eventually, the rest of his class had arrived, some sparkly blonde being the last to come out. They must have made the time limit because their teacher didn't say anything. Now that Izuku thought about it, he realized he didn't know the man's name. He looked familiar, but Izuku couldn't quite figure out who he was. Given that he taught at UA, he was likely a pro hero. Izuku, for all his hero trivia knowledge, could not for the life of him identify who this man was, and it was starting to irritate him. Bakugu. Their teacher fixed his gaze on Kaken as he spoke. You came first in the practical exam. How far could you throw a ball in middle school? Kaken's shoulders were hunched, and he all but glared at their teacher. He practically growled, about 67 meters. Their hobo of a teacher was unfazed. See how far you can throw it with your quirk, he said, and produced a throwing ball from his pocket and handed it to Kaken. He walked inside the circle, took a deep breath, drew his arm back, and threw. As the ball left Kaken's hand, he let out a large explosion, fire bursting everywhere, and the ball went flying. The class looked at the tablet that their teacher was showing, holding their breath. It read out the distance of the ball, the number continuing to go up for a few seconds before finally stopping at 705.2 meters. Ball throw, standing long jump, grip strength test. These are all things your middle school tested you on while prohibiting the use of quirks. Today, we'll be doing these tests with your quirks. This seemed pretty standard to Izuku. He had done this both with and without his quirk a few times in the past. This must not be the case for the rest of the class because they break out into excited chatter. That is, until someone was stupid enough to say, "This is going to be so much fun." Their teacher grinned from ear to ear. It wasn't a very nice smile. It was, if anything, rather malicious. After a pause, he said, "Fun, you say?" If possible, he somehow grinned wider. "Well then, whoever comes in last will be expelled. You're not here to have fun, you're here to learn to be heroes. Maybe this way, you'll learn from this." The class shuddered, and the teacher's grin faded, settling back into its neutral expression. "Netsu, you're next." Izuku straightened and walked towards the man, who handed him a ball to throw. Kaken started to yell. "What the F, did you just call him?" His voice grew louder as he spoke, and explosions started going off in his hands. "His name's not Netsu, he was cut off by the terrifying glare their teacher sent him." His eyes glowed red, and Kaken even stopped using his quirk. "If you dare call me that again. If you do, you won't have to bother coming back to my class. I know for a fact his name is Netsu Izuku." End of discussion. The man finished and turned to Izuku, nodding for him to continue. Izuku, for his part, had been frozen throughout the entire exchange. He had been shocked by Kaken's outburst initially, but then he realized who their teacher was. He wasn't sure, but he didn't know who else he could be. Eraserhead. The man froze, likely surprised to be recognized. He relaxed almost immediately, saying, "That's my hero name, you're to call me Aizawa-sensei." Izuku nodded and turned back to where he was going to throw. He let out 2 quick breaths, bursts of green fire escaping his lips which then wrapped around his forearms. He drew his right arm back in an L position, his other arm straight forward, skipped forward a little and threw, sending the fire over his hands to his fingertips as he did so. The ball burst forward, the number on Aizawa's tablet ticking up and up, eventually landing on 697.8 meters. Kaken grumbled at how close the score was to his, but nothing more. Izuku breathed in his fire and stepped out of the circle. The class took turns throwing the ball, and one girl with brown hair got infinity. Izuku made a mental note to keep an eye on her. There were 8 tests in all, and Izuku did fairly well at all of them. He gradually learned his classmates' names and their quirks as Aizawa-sensei called their names, and they stepped forward. Azui had asked to be called Tsu when she was called, and Izuku tentatively followed her example. Aizawa glared at them for a second before continuing without a word, though he did start to call them Tsu and Izuku. Aizawa seemed to watch him throughout all the tests though. He was continually getting the stink eye from the man. Nervous, he began to hyper-focus on the tests, hoping to avoid the man's gaze. 0. Aizawa had noticed Netsu's, or rather Izuku's, lack of thought before each test. Every other student spent time trying to figure out how they were going to pass each test, and wasn't that surprising? He may actually keep some of them this year, but Izuku had yet to even look thoughtful. He just went straight in without thinking. Granted, he did well, but there would come a day when going in without thinking wouldn't work for him, and then what would he do? Aizawa would have to talk with him. 0. When the final results were displayed, Izuku landed in second, behind Yaoyorozu. He noticed Hagakure ended up in last. It was a shame. She was basically quirkless the whole time since she had to wear the uniform. She did try to confuse the censors by waving her hand in front of them so that they would show higher numbers, but she only ended up short-circuiting them. Before Aizawa-sensei could speak, there was an uproar in the back of the crowd. Izuku looked back to see Kaken holding Mineta up by the back of his shirt. "What the F do you think you're doing, you shitty little grape?" Aizawa-sensei started to speak, presumably to lecture and maybe expel Kaken, but Yaoyorozu cut him off. "Please don't get angry at him, Aizawa-sensei." He stopped Mineta from all. Her face grew red and her expression sheepish. "Stopped him from what?" Aizawa-sensei prompted. She somehow flushed even more at that. "Well, grabbing me. Inappropriately." Aizawa-sensei's eyes flashed red, seeming to lose control of his quirk. He calmed himself before he said, Mineta, grab your things and go to the principal's office. You're expelled. Mineta started to protest, but Kakin started to shake him violently so he couldn't speak. When he finally stopped trying, Kakin dropped him and looked at their teacher. Mineta thankfully took the hint and walked away, mumbling something unintelligible and shoulders drooping. Aizawa-sensei continued as if nothing had happened. As you can see, Hagakure came in last. Everyone turned to look at her. She shrank a little under their gaze. Lucky for her, this was a logical ruse. No one else is getting expelled. The class brightened, but not much. Given Mineta's hasty expulsion, they weren't so sure he was telling the truth. Everyone go clean up and head to class. Izuku, stay here. Izuku startled but didn't protest. A few concerned glances were thrown his way. He received a glare from Kakin, had likely been hoping to attempt to use this time to attempt to corner him again. Once everyone had left, Aizawa finally spoke. I know you weren't trying very hard today. Do you really think you can skate by and become a hero without putting the effort because you have such a great quirk? Izuku flinched. I was trying, I swear. These tests are just kinda routine for me. I promise I was trying to get the best score I could. I think I even beat a couple of my old ones. Desperation had started to creep into his voice, and Izuku inwardly cringed at the sound. You mean you've done these quirk tests before? Middle schools can't allow you to use your quirks. How have you done them? Izuku's eyes widened. You must not have read my file. Aizawa-sensei simply stared. The HPSC has been in charge of my education since I was 4. I do these every month to demonstrate my progress, he stammered. There was silence for a moment. Go to class. Izuku practically scurried away. 0. Their teachers were like a who's who of pro heroes. All Might had yet to teach them, but in the meantime, they had Present Mic to teach the English, Cementos to teach modern literature, and even Snipe and Midnight taught classes. Though, Midnight said some frankly concerning things throughout the class. It shouldn't be okay for a group of teenagers to turn on a 20-something-year-old woman. At the end of the school day, Izuku loitered at his desk, knowing HPSC officers were going to pick him up once he left. Before he had time to think about it, a hand slammed down on his desk, an explosion burning its surface. We need to FNG talk. Izuku sighed. He knew this conversation was coming and had been dreading it all day. He didn't like dredging up the past. All right, Kakin. Let's talk. In which an important conversation is had. It was just the two of them in the classroom, the teacher likely believing they were staying to clean. Kakin was towering over Izuku, his hand resting on Izuku's desk. The two stared at each other for a moment before Izuku calmly asked, All right, what do you want to know? Bakugo's eye twitched, and Izuku knew he had struck a nerve. What the hell do you think I want to FNG know? Izuku breezily replied, I dunno, you tell me. I have no idea what they told you about why I was taken. I wasn't exactly there when you found out, you know. Kakin's eye twitched again. They didn't tell us FNG sheet. The DMN lawyers just kept running us in circles. The only thing we found out was that you weren't even in FENG foster care. Your parents went through lawyer after lawyer until he cut himself off, eyes widening as if he had revealed too much. Until what, Kakin? Izuku pressed. Kakin visibly flinched away, his hand no longer on Izuku's desk. Your parents? Well, your dad? Kakin trailed off and seemed to be looking everywhere except Izuku. What are you dancing around, Kakin? I don't have time for this, I'm getting picked up in like 15 minutes. Izuku was starting to get concerned. Did his dad die? Izuku hadn't even gotten to attend his funeral if that was the case. His dad couldn't be dead, As Izuku's thoughts started to spiral, Kakin's brows knit together. Who's picking you up? Pretty sure you can FNG walk by yourself. Izuku's eyes narrowed. I'll answer your question once you answer mine. Please don't tell me my dad died. Kakin leaned even further back a bit in surprise. What the No, your dad's not effing dead. He got tired of searching after a few years and your parents divorced. Kakin's posture turned tense like he hadn't meant to say it. He glared at Izuku while he processed. Izuku wasn't sure how to feel about that. On one hand, he understood. He knew the HPSC made him impossible for his parents to find, and his father was always a results-driven man. On the other, he felt like his father gave up on him. And if his parents divorced, where did that leave his mother? Was his dad still sending her money? He assumed so, but he hadn't seen the man in over a decade. And if they divorced over this, that likely meant that she kept pointlessly searching? That meant she was still worrying, and Izuku didn't want that. So, he did what he usually did with feelings too big to handle in front of other people. He stuffed it in a box and shoved it into a forgotten corner of his mind so he could maybe process it when he was alone. Not wanting to discuss the topic of his father any further, he decided to answer Kaken's question. A couple of HPSC agents are going to drive me home. They don't want to risk me getting caught in a villain attack while walking there. Izuku looked up at Kaken as he said this, maintaining eye contact. Kaken stared back at him for a moment, looking torn before sitting in the chair in front of Izuku's desk and facing him. His voice was as quiet as Izuku had ever heard it when he asked, "Are they the fuckers who took you?" Izuku nodded. "Do you remember," Izuku started, "how I was in the news less than a week before I was taken? For stopping a mugging?" Kaken hesitated before nodding. Well, that attracted the attention of the HPSC. No one spoke. Then Kaken asked, his voice cracked and broken, "Why?" His posture steady, Izuku replied, "Have you heard of the Caretaker Initiative?" Kaken shook his head. It's a program within the HPSC to train young kids to be top heroes. Because I had a fire quirk, which is generally a very strong quirk, and I had performed such heroism so young, I was a perfect candidate. Izuku's gaze was unwavering as he spoke. He appeared entirely unaffected by the conversation, Kaken less so. He was shaking. "This whole time, you were being taught how to be a hero?" He was standing up now. His face was red and twisted with anger. "Is that hard to believe?" Izuku was still sitting. He pet his head, genuinely confused. This was what Kaken was stuck on? Effing yes. You were already was going to be the strongest, but they didn't need you, were already perfect for being a hero. And now, Kaken's whole body shuddered, and if Izuku didn't know any better, he'd say his eyes were wet. "You haven't smiled at all today. You were going to be a hero with a smile on your effing face while I beat up the villains, but now..." His whole body locked up as he ran out of words to say. That's what this was about. Silence stretched between the two. "I'm sorry," Izuku murmured. And he was. There was nothing he could say to Kaken to make this better. There was nothing he could do. Glancing at the clock, Izuku quietly slipped out of the room, leaving Kaken to his thoughts. -0. Katsuki didn't understand. Sure, Izuku hadn't been very strong. He was knocked down easily, and he was always so quick to cry, but Katsuki had never seen someone get back up as quickly as him. Izuku had once been so empathetic, so emotional. Now he just wasn't. Katsuki didn't understand. -0. Izuku stepped out into the front pathway looking for 2 suits and a black car of some sort. He had told the HPSC to pick him up 15 minutes after school ended so he would have time to talk to a teacher if needed. He really just wanted to be able to spend more time away from the HPSC. Imagine his surprise when he found, not suits waiting for him, but Takami Kigo, leaning against the gate facing the door. He was wearing a specially made red shirt and light blue jeans, and plain red sneakers. His hair was kept out of his face with black sunglasses. "Kigo-san, what are you doing here?" A smile stretched across Izuku's face. Kigo chuckled, pushing himself off the gate. "I managed to convince Mara to let me pick my little brother up on the first day of school. This is only for today though. The suits have been running me ragged lately." He sighed, rolling his eyes, but a calm smile directed at Izuku settled on his face. "So what's school like? Tell me what I missed out on." Izuku was all too happy to oblige. Practically jumping over to him, he started speaking 1,000 words a minute. "There are so many cool quirks in my class. There's this one girl who can negate gravity and she threw a ball and the distance reader read infinity, and there's this other guy who I think is Endeavor's son who I remembered from the wreck." "Izuku," Kigo was chuckling, "I can't keep up with you. You need to speak slower." Izuku flushed. Well, all the teachers here are heroes, as you probably already know. My homeroom teacher is Eraserhead, and he's kinda intense. He's expelled one kid already and threatened to expel another, though apparently, that was just a logical ruse. He gave one of the quirk tests like we did for the director and said he would expel whoever came in last. Kigo looked thoughtful. How'd you do? I came in second. The girl who beat me can create anything from her own cells. I wonder if it's restricted to certain kinds, like muscle tissue or lipids. Money's on lipids since it seemed to come from something internal, and I can't think of anything other than that wouldn't cause health issues immediately. She couldn't use muscle tissue, nerves, bone, or organ tissue, at least not at the quantities she used it. I'll have to ask her. The two meandered around town in the general direction of their destination for a while, a few recognizing Kigo's wings, but not many bothered him while he was out of costume. They ended up having to stop a few times so he could autograph something or take a picture with someone, but Izuku didn't mind. He got to see Kigo so rarely these days, he was determined to make the most of it. An hour later, they had arrived at the HPSC building where Izuku lived. Well, this is it. I gotta head back to my agency to get changed and patrol, so I'll see you later. Neither were big on contact, so Izuku just nodded enthusiastically before Kigo waved goodbye and walked away. Once he was out of eyesight, Izuku's whole body drooped, and his eyes dulled a bit. He headed inside, up to his room, and got ready to do his homework. He would probably have a suit come in later to train him, so he had to make the most of the time he had. -0. You must not have read my file. The words itched at Shoyuta. The truth was he hadn't, not really. He had given it a cursory glance, but he had been expecting to expel a large portion of his class, and so hadn't thought it worth his time. It was something that could wait a day. He had made sure he knew the basics, such as name, quirk, and allergies, but he hadn't looked into past education or guardianship. He had assumed it wouldn't matter for today's exercise. That was what truly bothered Shoyuta. He had started to make assumptions, and it had come back to bite him. Now, here he sat, reading Netsu's file first. There wasn't much if you didn't know what you were looking for. His previous education listed him as homeschooled. His medical record didn't have anything concerning in it. There wasn't much to set off red flags. Until you noticed that no home phones were listed for emergency contacts, only work numbers were given. That his guardians listed him as a ward of the HPSC. That despite clearly having been physically trained his entire life because of this fact, he had nothing in his medical record besides vaccinations. Not one sprained ankle, a broken bone, or even a bad stomach bug. Shoyuta wasn't entirely sure what this all meant when put together. He didn't particularly like the picture he was seeing, but there wasn't anything specifically wrong with it, either. He didn't know exactly what to do with this information. Shoyuta hated not knowing something. He decided he would have to keep an eye on the problem child. -0. Netsu. It had been barely 45 minutes when a suit walked in. Izuku had been finishing his last about me questionnaire his teachers gave him. If someone asked him why he wanted to be a hero one more time, get dressed and come to the training gym. You're needed. Izuku bowed his head before standing up and going to get changed into something more athletic. He changed into a dark green shirt and black track pants as well as his favorite red sneakers. When he walked back out into the common room, he glanced at the door that had once led to Kigo's room. The plaque that had once read his name was bare, ready for someone to move in. All of the rooms except Izuku's were ready. He didn't like thinking about it. He stepped into the elevator and pressed the floor below his. He wondered what he would be expected to do today. -0. As it turned out, he was expected to do combat training. He generally preferred it over quirk training, but it still left him bruised and sore the next morning. He actually won most of his sparring matches, but that didn't mean his but didn't get handed to him yesterday. His alarm went off and he groaned just like every morning. He went downstairs to do his morning workout just like every morning. He took a shower afterward just like every morning. What was different this time, however, was that this time he changed into his school uniform. This time suits were waiting to drive him to UA. As a bonus, he was fairly sure his first heroics class was today. He hoped it wouldn't be like his training with the HPSC. He would also get to talk to Kaken. There were a few questions he wanted to ask that he hadn't gotten the chance to yesterday. He got in the car to ride to UA, almost excited for the day to come. It made him wonder if he actually did want to become a hero after all. In which Izuku starts his first heroics class. Hi. I'm Takami Kigo. I'm in the room next to yours. Midoriya Izuku didn't know what to make of the kid who looked more than twice his age, but his mother taught him manners were important, so he responded with a quiet, I'm Midoriya Izuku. The blonde's eyes softened. What's wrong? Midoriya promptly burst into tears. I want to go home. He didn't like this room, he didn't know these people, he wanted his mother. His whole world didn't make sense anymore, and he didn't like it. The other kid's eyes widened in understanding before softening even more than before. I understand. My mom and I didn't really have a great relationship, but I would still like to see her again, I guess. But I don't think either of us will see our moms again. Izuku started crying with renewed vigor, causing the other boy to panic. But hey, we're both here now, we have each other. Let's become great heroes together, yeah? He sounded so sad as he spoke. As much as Midoriya found his words disheartening, they were soft and comforting. It reminded him of his mother, in a somewhat melancholy way. He had already run out of most of his tears by the time he had gotten here while he was stuck in that car, and his wails turned quickly into sniffles. The older boy slowly shuffled forward, crouched down, and awkwardly wrapped his arms around him. It wasn't nearly as good a hugger as Midoriya's mother, but Midoriya would take what he could get right now, and buried his face in the kid's shoulder. What's your name again? Midoriya asked. It came out muffled since his face was still covered up. He felt rather than saw the kid smile. Takami Kigo. You should just call me Kigo though. Takami's not my real name. My hero name is gonna be Hawks. What's yours gonna be? Midoriya mumbled out a soft, All Might Jr. He felt an airy, carefree laugh come from Kigo-san. Don't make fun of me, he whined. I'm not, I promise. That sounds perfect to me. 0. When Izuku entered the classroom, he saw that he had been beaten there by 3 students, Bakugo, Ida, and Todoroki. Ida was currently trying and failing to strike up a conversation with Todoroki. Ignoring that, Izuku took his seat behind Kaken. He spent a good few seconds purposefully placing his backpack next to his seat. He tapped his fingers against the desk and looked out the window. His fingers crescendoed before he stopped in favor of tapping his foot against the floor. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed, before leaning forward. He stopped fidgeting. His voice low, he said, My mom. The words felt awkward in his mouth. He had shut her out of his mind and put her in a box for a long time since he knew he wouldn't see her again. It felt wrong to call her his mom. How is she? Kaken's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. She's been better. His voice was gruff and scratchy. It made Izuku was curious about what kind of expression he wore. Has she moved on? Izuku wasn't quite sure which answer he wanted to hear. Even with his newfound contact with Kaken, he still wasn't likely to see her again. Kaken didn't speak for a long time. Izuku waited patiently even as he worried over whether Kaken would ever answer, whether he had even heard Izuku, even as students slowly trickled in and started forming clusters around various desks. He was about to ask again before Kaken finally replied. Not as much as she probably could have. None of us did, though, except your dad. He hightailed it all the way to Finji America. Izuku cringed at the words. Kaken had never been one for tact. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before speaking. I have one more question. Yesterday you said Netsu wasn't my name. Legally it is. The HPSC changed it. Kaken growled. Not hearing FNG question here, numbnuts. What did you think it was before? Izuku trailed off, not wanting to extrapolate. At this, Kaken spun around, eyes wide, noisily sliding his chair a bit with him and earning him a few confused glances from their classmates. He whispered, Do you mean you forgot your idiot's Midoriya? Midoriya blinked. Of course. How could he have forgotten? It matched his hair and his eyes. He had loved his name, how could he have forgotten it? Before he could think about it too much, Aizawa-sensei came in, this time dragging his sleeping bag behind him rather than crawling in it. He looked like he needed several cups of black coffee or a nap. He gazed out at the class for several seconds, his eyes black and calculating. You'll be having your first heroics class today. Try to contain your excitement. He continued to glare at the class a bit longer, as if daring them to react, before zipping open the bright yellow bag and stepping inside. He zipped it closed and fell asleep in the far corner of the room. The class stared in bemusement for all of 2 seconds before breaking out into nervous chatter. A quiet "T" came from Kakin as he pulled out his notes from yesterday and started aggressively studying it. Midoriya hadn't even known it was possible to look so angry and focused at the same time. Midoriya took his position leaning against the window to his left and resting his head against it as he gazed outside. It was an exceptionally beautiful day. Maybe heroics training will have him outside today. That would be nice. A few minutes went on like this before the sound of thundering footsteps heading toward the classroom. The door crashed aside as the number 1 hero himself strode in, extraordinarily boisterous. "I am here. Coming through the door like a hero." A beat of silence. Is that All Might? Is that his Bronze Age costume? No, it's his Silver Age one. We're actually being taught by All Might? Yue is so awesome. Voices clamored to be heard over one another as All Might stood at the front of the classroom with his fists on his hips. Midoriya remained mostly unaffected. He was excited to see his childhood idol and even more excited that he would be Midoriya's teacher, but his enthusiasm for his hero felt gray and distant, like something beyond his reach. So, he sat in his seat and watched his classmates' reactions with keen interest. Even Kakin chimed in, shouting about how he would surpass All Might when he became a hero. When the noise died down, All Might spoke again. Today will be your first introduction to heroics class, possibly the most important class at UA. Before we begin, however, you'll have to dress the part. All Might gestured to the far wall, which shifted, as 4 racks each with 5 numbered briefcases slid out. Inside those, you'll find your hero costumes you sent UA designs for. Put them on and meet me at Training Ground Beta. Having finished what he had come to do, he dashed away just as quickly as he had come, leaving a trail of smoke behind him. Students crowded the racks of hero costumes, excitedly chattering amongst themselves, and Glasses just about had a conniption. Both hands were karate chopping, his voice just a note higher and just a touch louder. Once a decent chunk of the class had trickled out of the classroom after having grabbed their costume, Izuku shuffled forward and hesitantly grabbed his own before heading to the changing rooms himself. The suits had said they would handle all the UA paperwork, and Izuku hadn't even known that included the designs for his costume. He wasn't sure whether he was excited to see what they had chosen for him or dreading it. He decided to be somewhat excited since that was easier, and they had done a decent enough job with Kigo's costume, even if it didn't look even remotely like what he had asked for. When he got to the locker room, he saw that Kakin and several others had gotten there first. There was some conversation amongst them, but most were engrossed with their costumes. He found a mostly private corner and began to change into his own. As a base, there were pine green combat boots and black pants. There was also a black long-sleeved shirt with pine green geometric patterns stretching down the length of the sleeves with acid green accents. Over top, there was a pine green, short-sleeved hoodie that only fell halfway down to his waist and a matching belt, as well as green leather gloves with large reinforced cuffs stretching just above his wrist. To top it all off, there was a green visor that attached to his head using black straps. When he had put on all the pieces of his costume and went outside, he found himself grateful for its simplicity. He saw one guy in clothing so sparkly it defied logic and another in white armor that looked entirely too inefficient and cumbersome for Izuku's tastes. There were a few more costumes that caught his eye, one of which belonged to Yaoyorozu, who wore what essentially amounted to 2 red horizontal stripes. She wore a sleeveless top with a boat neck and white patterning that left her midriff exposed and shorts underneath a thick, dull yellow belt that had a special pocket for what appeared to be a chemistry textbook. Interesting, did she need to know the chemical compositions of the things she made? She also wore red boots with yellow accents and heels the same color as her belt. He took the opportunity to observe his surroundings as well. This was more along the lines of what he had been expecting to see from the like of UA. It looked like the recreation of a small rundown city. They were likely going to do some kind of battle exercise then. All Might would only bring them to a city setting if he was planning on teaching them how to work in a city setting. Izuku found this unwise. He didn't know how many of his classmates had studied combat before the entrance exam, but a good chunk had flashy enough quirks that they could probably have skated by without much training in that area. Regardless, it was not his position to complain or question his teachers, and if the others fell behind, well, he supposed he'd have to find some way to help them. At last, everyone had changed into their hero costumes, and All Might launched into an explanation of what they would be doing that day. They would be doing battle trials, and Izuku felt a small measure of pride well up within him for predicting this, as well as disappointment in his teacher for starting them off with this. Now, since there are only 19 of you, would any be willing to go alone or go twice? Izuku's hand shot up, and without waiting to be called on he said, "I have no problem going twice." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Endeavor's kid and Kakin give him matching glares. Kakin started growling but otherwise didn't protest. Todoroki, on the other hand, deigned to finally speak in front of the class. "I would like to go alone." All Might's smile froze as if he had no idea what to do with multiple volunteers, and ended up ruling in Izuku's favor since Izuku had spoken first. He took out a piece of paper and presumably wrote Izuku's name on it before putting it in a cardboard box. "Now that that's settled, let us draw teams." Immediately, Glasses raised his hand and spoke without waiting to be called on. "Sir, is it a good idea for the teams to be randomized?" Izuku barely stopped himself from rolling his eyes. That was the kid's problem with the exercise? On the field of battle, you are seldom granted the luxury of choosing your partner. Without saying any more, he pulled their names out of the cardboard box to put them in teams A through J, then used a bingo cage that rolled out lettered ping-pong ball to determine who would go against who. Overall, the matches were as follows. Hero Team D, Shuji and Jair versus Villain Team A, Hagakure and Aoyama. Hero Team B, Ojiro and Izuku versus Villain Team H, Satu and Siro. Hero Team J, Tokoyami and Ida versus Villain Team C, Koda and Kirishima. Hero Team G, Yaoyorozu and Kaminari versus Villain Team E, Uraraka and Azui. Hero Team F, Todoroki and Izuku versus Villain Team I, Bakugo and Ishido. Izuku looked through the crowd to find his partners. He noticed Todoroki first, but he had already turned away from him and was heading towards the observation room. Oh well, he thought, I'd be better off planning with Ojiro anyway, since our match will be first. He'd try to talk to Todoroki later. Luckily, Ojiro had already found Izuku and was striding towards him. They nodded at each other and wordlessly headed to the observation room together, Izuku keeping an eye on Satu and Siro. Satu's strength quirk should be easy to get around, but Siro might be a bit tricky. Hagakure, Aoyama, Shuji, and Jairu splintered off. All Might give them all earbuds that presumably acted as communication devices. Once in a dark room with one wall completely covered in TV screens, Izuku turned to Ojiro. "I have a plan." Ojiro looked over at him and pet his head, showing he was listening. -0. Hagakure was deciding more and more that she didn't like Aoyama as the match went on. No, that wasn't quite it. She just really didn't want to be on a team with him. She didn't like the way he kept drawing attention to himself, and she hated the way he kept accidentally drawing attention to her. He seemed to be giving the exercise his all, which was commendable, but his all seemed to be a bit too. It took Jiro and Shuji all of 1 minute to find and reach Aoyama, babbling in French as he was. Turns out his belly button laser has a hard limit, and the fight didn't last long. They hid behind corners until he couldn't fire it anymore, and needless to say, he didn't last long after that. Hagakure tried to create noises to distract them from the bomb, but they just ended up splitting up, Jairu going after her while Shuji used his eyes and ears to try and find the bomb. Hagakure was never captured, at least, but she didn't win. She had learned how to be good at using her body language to demonstrate how she felt, but she was always good at concealing her feelings when she wanted to. -0. There was some debate when they got back over who had performed the best. At first, People had only considered Jairu and Shuji since they had won. Izuku was finding it pretty tiring. Yayorozu looked like she had something she wanted to say but didn't want to speak out. Izuku decided to fall on that sword for her. The MVP was obviously Hagakure. The entire class turned to look at him, faces bug-eyed. Hagakure herself actually jumped, and her gloves turned to face him. Some shy voice in the back of the room that Izuku couldn't place said, "But she lost." Izuku sighed. Yeah, because she got stuck with a bad team-up, particularly considering who they were up against. When her partner was apprehended, she made the best of a bad situation, was able to distract one of her two opponents, and still managed to evade capture. There was room for improvement, but that's true across the board. The class continued to stare at him before All Might started coughing into a tissue. Yes, perfect analysis of the situation, young Netsu. Does anyone else have anything else to add? No one did. Alright, teams B and H, go take your positions. The next round will start in 15 minutes. 0. Izuku was pretty sure he liked Ojiro. He was a good guy. He pitched a few ideas, was overall quiet and attentive, and seemed like a decently competent guy. Competence was one of Izuku's favorite character traits in a person. Their plan depended on what Shiro would be doing in relation to Satu. Would he be on his own or with Satu? Given the success the last winning team had splitting up and the failure that the losing team had for not doing it sooner, they would be separating. That made Izuku's job infinitely easier. Ojiro and Izuku wouldn't even bother with the bomb. They would aim to apprehend both villains. It was simple. Their opponents would prioritize protecting the bomb, and the two would ambush them while they were on their own. Satu was easy. Izuku and Ojiro were both quick and could dance around him until they could overpower him. Izuku also had a suspicion about what happens when Satu eats sugar that made things even easier. Izuku had to plan around Shiro. Based on the quirk assessment, Shiro seemed to have wonderful control over his quirk. There were probably traps all around the building with his tape that they would have to avoid. A buzzer sounded, and Izuku opened the door, Ojiro close behind him. They took corners slowly, Izuku taking the lead. Just as Izuku had thought, several doorways and tight turns were covered in strips of tape that easily would have restrained them both had they not been careful. After about 2 minutes of tense silence and dodging traps, they were able to find Shiro patrolling the halls, his feet clacking against the floor. Izuku made a circular motion with his hand to Ojiro, who nodded and went to circle around Shiro. Once he was out of sight, Izuku stepped out in front of Shiro, who stopped short and let out a noise of surprise that, under different circumstances, might have made Izuku laugh. Izuku puffed out 4 short breaths of flame, green fire wrapping around his wrists and ankles in small bands, a chill settling into him as Shiro rushed towards him, tape spewing out of his elbows. Izuku stood his ground, flaring his arms out to knock Shiro's out of the way. Shiro stumbled back a few steps before coming at Izuku again. This time Izuku jabbed at his stomach. When he grunted and doubled over in pain, Izuku grabbed his right arm and placed it behind his back, grabbing what tape had already been released by that elbow and wrapping it around Shiro's torso as quickly as he could, effectively locking his arm in place. Shiro surged upward, his head knocking against Izuku's jaw. Izuku careened backward, but then Ojiro was there, sweeping Shiro's leg out from under him. Ojiro took out a roll of capture tape and swiftly encircled Shiro's left wrist with it. All Might's voice rang out over some kind of intercom. Shiro Hanta has been captured. Ah man, I didn't even see Ojiro coming. Shiro complained while sitting on the ground. Ojiro waited while Izuku caught his breath. After a couple of seconds, Izuku said, "Nice save." "Thank you." Ojiro nodded. Izuku took a deep breath in, the flames on his wrists and ankles flowing back into his mouth, and he felt the warmth bleed into him again. He sighed with contentment before continuing to find Satu, who was likely guarding the bomb. It took a bit more time to find Satu than it had Shiro, about 5 minutes, the bomb being kept in some forgotten corner of the top floor. Satu was planted in front of it, gravely watching every entrance into the room. His whole body was lined with tension, his knees bent and shoulders tight. Izuku turned to Ojiro and murmured, "We can't ambush him like we did Shiro, so we'll have to rush him." You keep left of me and we'll charge him together, yeah? Ojiro gazed at Satu for a moment longer from around a corner before turning back to Izuku and nodding. Izuku started counting down from 3 with his fingers. At 0, he jumped through the doorway and raced towards Satu, Ojiro right next to him. Every breath Izuku let out as he ran sent flames to his legs and helping him go faster. When he was only a few feet away from Satu, he slowed and transferred half of his fire to his arms, swinging a large right hook aimed right at Satu's nose. Ojiro came up behind Izuku and aimed a kick at Satu's right side, making it impossible for Satu to dodge Izuku before spinning around and hitting the same spot with his tail. Satu fell back a bit but remained upright, his arms outstretched as if to protect the fake bomb. There was a brief pause as the trio tried to get their bearings when Satu suddenly lashed out towards Izuku. In response, he lifted his arms, which were still covered in fire, to block the attack, expecting Satu to change trajectory to avoid the flame. Satu did not change his trajectory. His fist struck Izuku's arm and he lurched back, his eyes wide in pain as he cradled his fist to his chest. Izuku in a breath, recalling most of the flame on his forearms so that only his wrists remained covered. Apparently not one to learn from his previous mistakes in battle, Satu tried again with his other hand. Izuku moved to dodge, but Ojiro blocked it and swept his legs out from under him similarly to how he had done Zero. Before Satu had even finished falling, Izuku leaned over and wrapped his wrist in capture tape. Again, All Might's voice rang out over the intercom. Satu Rikido has been captured by the hero team. The hero team wins. All right. Ojiro smiled and raised his hand for a high five, which Izuku hesitantly returned. His smile dimmed somewhat at that before leaning down to help Satu up. You should probably have Recovery Girl check out that burn man, it might be pretty bad, Ojiro said. Izuku glanced at Satu's fist and nodded. It wasn't bad enough to be too concerning, but it would certainly sting for a while if he didn't get it seen to. Satu let out a few confused-sounding grunts before saying, "Oh, yeah, I'll go ask All Might." Ojiro agreed to walk Satu back while Izuku went to find Zero and untie him. Eventually, they all made their way back to the observation room and Satu got permission to go see Recovery Girl. The ensuing debate named Izuku the MVP since he had done all the strategizing and had been the one to ultimately capture Satu. Izuku soaked in the praise but otherwise didn't show much reaction, though he did put in a good word for Ojiro for having his back during both fights. When it was time for the next group to go, he walked up to Todoroki. "Hey, now that Ojiro and I have gone, we can start strategizing, yeah?" Todoroki ignored him. "Look, I get that you don't like me for some reason, but we're probably going to be graded on how well we work together, so it would be really nice if we could, work together." Todoroki turned his head to look at Izuku and seemed to size him up. "I'll be able to take care of our opponents on my own. You didn't have to go twice." Before Izuku could respond, Todoroki stalked away to the other side of the room, leaving Izuku to glare at him. He was beginning to realize his next battle trial would be a nightmare. In which Todoroki is an idiot. There would be 2 more matches before Izuku had to go again, and he was furiously trying to plan around his own teammate, which was irritating, to say the least. To make his bad mood worse, his arms still throbbed from when Satu hit it in the last match. Todoroki was standing on the other side of the room, his face impassive. Izuku sighed and directed his attention to the monitors adorning the far wall, trying to see if the ongoing match could provide any aid for his own. 0. Koda was terrified of speaking. He couldn't even particularly explain why, but even just considering the thought made him intensely uncomfortable. At least, when he was around people. Kirishima, bless his sweet heart, seemed to be making every effort to communicate with Koda and make him feel comfortable speaking. Koda was touched. But at the same time, some traitorous part of his mind screamed at him that speaking to Kirishima would only end in heartbreak, twisting his tongue into knots any time he opened his mouth to talk. So, Kirishima ended up coming up with the idea to guard the bomb together. Koda knew JSL, and showed Kirishima a few relevant signs at his request, such as left and right, to be used to coordinate where they would go when defending or fighting against their opponents. They placed the bomb on the 2nd floor, thinking that the hero team wouldn't search too seriously until further up. 0. Ida was aware that he was a rigid student, and while even he knew his need for order was just slightly short of neurotic at times, he could be a team player too. He asked Tokoyami, his partner for this exercise, if he had any ideas. He proposed that they search for the bomb together. Ida would take the lead so that Tokoyami would not be in the way should Ida need to suddenly dash forward. Many had accused Ida of being uncaring, prioritizing law and order over the needs of others. This simply was not true. He took great pains to observe his classmates. He was fairly certain Koda had issues verbally communicating, and that separating from his teammate would be disastrous, as he likely wouldn't be able to speak over comms. Knowing this, he agreed, believing that getting split up would only lead to them being overpowered. Ida was also extraordinarily diligent. He and Tokoyami searched every nook and cranny of the first floor in the most expedient fashion possible before moving on to the next, so it took them almost 6 minutes to find the bomb. Ida had been checking every corner before turning, Tokoyami trailing faithfully behind him. They should have been able to take the villain team by surprise, but something must have tipped them off, as Kirishima immediately shot towards Ida. They were forced into a brawl immediately, which, as it turned out, Kirishima was quite skilled at. Koda hung out in the back, murmuring orders to a couple of pigeons that then flew at Tokoyami's face. Like bats, trying to prevent him from overpowering Kirishima, who was stuck fighting the both of them. Ida kept sending powerful kicks Kirishima's way, and he in turn raised a hardened arm each time to block them. His whole body was hardened. His movements were slower than Ida expected, but he still managed to keep up with Ida's attacks. Tokoyami's dark shadow finally waved off the birds, sending them crashing through the window. In the dim light of the room, he seemed more corporeal than he had during the quirk assessment the day before. Ida didn't think about it for very long. He suddenly found himself distracted by a rat crawling all over him and biting at the weak points in his armor. Had Dark Shadow not managed to free himself, Kirishima may have defeated him then and there with the massive opening the rat provided him. As it was, Dark Shadow immediately attracted all of Kirishima's attention, clawing and shoving and biting at him. Kirishima started to dodge more than he blocked, a few hits even eliciting a pained grunt from their classmate. His stamina was obviously running out, and Ida had finally managed to fling the rat off of himself, slightly disgusted at the thought of handling vermin whose previous whereabouts were completely unknown. Instead of running to capture Kirishima, however, Ida raced towards Koda before he could create another distraction. It didn't take much effort. The poor villain clearly had no training in hand-to-hand, and a few well-placed kicks easily sent him crashing down before Ida wrapped the capture tape around his wrist. That finished, he turned to the bomb that was behind Koda. Before he could take another step, however, Kirishima abruptly appeared in front of Ida, out of breath and a few bruises forming on his torso. Before he could react, Kirishima crouched down and jabbed at Ida's thighs with hardened fists, the only place not covered in metal armor. While painful, Ida found he could still move and raised a kick in response, aiming straight for Kirishima's gut and causing him to double over. Was his quirk weakening? Tossing aside the thought, Ida zipped by him and grabbed the fake bomb. Tokoyami stepped between him and Kirishima to make sure he couldn't stop Ida. Ida's hands slammed against the fake bomb and All Might's voice rang out over the intercoms, saying, "Ida Tenya has managed to capture the bomb, the hero team wins. -0. There was some debate over whether Kirishima or Ida should be MVP of the round. Ida looked over to see Izuku, MVP of the last match and the decider of the one before it, lurking in the corner, his eyes calculating as he analyzed the crowd. He must have had no input for the argument. Ultimately, Ida was named the MVP since he not only won but managed to do so without serious injury or quirk exhaustion. Ida found himself blushing at the praise and happened to notice Izuku nodding his approval before seeming to turn his attention inward. Ida found it curious that he wasn't conversing with his teammate, but Ida decided not to intervene. Perhaps they had already come up with a plan. -0. Uraraka found the bomb deceptively lightweight and easy to carry to where she and Tsu wanted to hide it. She said as much to Tsu, who went a little bug-eyed at the implication. "Uraraka, your quirk is limited by weight, isn't it?" Azui asked. Uraraka nodded a bit hesitantly. I think I have a different plan. Uraraka listened in rapt attention as Azui spoke. Essentially, Uraraka would run around the upper floors with the bomb, while Azui distracted the hero team. Uraraka loved the idea but was a bit concerned about how well she would be able to enact her part in it. Well, you never know until you try, right? Plus Ultra. -0. Yaoyorozu was a very shy person. She maintained a quiet confidence in her abilities but still found herself worrying over how best to diplomatically share her thoughts and ideas. Kaminari left the floor to her, however, and she found it much easier to share the plan she had come up with. My quirk lets me discharge a bunch of electricity at once. I can't actually aim it though, so I'm at risk of hurting you if I let loose too close to you, Kaminari had said. I'm really not good at planning though, so I'm willing to go with whatever you've got. Yaoyorozu thought for a moment before replying, I think we should stick together. There's strength in numbers and my quirk can counteract yours. Kaminari's eyebrows shot up. Really? Sweet. He scratched his head. How? Yaoyorozu paused. I can make an insulated sheet that your electric currents won't pass through so you can release as much as you want to. Kaminari smiled. Sounds like a plan. Shortly after their conversation, All Might announced the start of the match. They weren't as thorough in their search as the last team had been, only spending about 2 minutes on each floor as opposed to 5. Soon enough, they ran into Asutsu. Yaoyorozu didn't see Uraraka anywhere. They must have split up and Uraraka must have been the one assigned to guard the bomb. Tsu leaped from wall to wall, occasionally lashing her tongue out at the two in quick strikes. Yaoyorozu created a large sheet from her lower back and crouched down as it settled over her. Now Kaminari, she shouted, and Kaminari grinned. Bright yellow light filled the hallway and crackling yellow lightning flowed from Kaminari to Tsu, locking up her muscles and sending her falling to the floor. Several seconds passed before the light faded and it was safe to come out. Tsu lay twitching on the floor, groaning every now and then. I think you may have overdone it, Kaminari. She turned to face him, startled to find him babbling incoherently and holding both thumbs up, drool dribbling from his mouth. He was wandering around in different directions, and she had to stop him from walking headfirst into a wall. She found herself torn between leaving her teammate and continuing to search for the bomb. She decided to wait for a minute to see if the symptoms abated with time. They didn't. She waited another minute, not wanting to deviate from the plan. By the time she finally managed to tear herself away from Kaminari, there were only 5 minutes left in the match. She jogged, hoping to find the bomb before time ran out. It would be logical to assume that Uraraka was guarding the bomb. She raced up several floors, keeping an ear out for the sound of footsteps. With 2 minutes left in the exam, she heard it. The clicking sound of heels against the tiled floor. Yaoyorozu raced towards the noise, desperately hoping she wasn't too late. She reached the room where she thought she heard it coming from, and there was nothing. The noise was gone too. Thoroughly bewildered, Yaoyorozu continued to wander the same floor. A minute left on the clock, she heard it again. Dashing in that direction, she twisted and turned, finding that the sound was moving. Was Uraraka patrolling? Was the bomb somewhere else and completely undefended? Yaoyorozu came to a full stop, indecision swarming her. What was supposed to do? She shook herself. If she managed to capture Uraraka, she and Kaminari would win the match. She knew where Uraraka was, so she should definitely try to capture her. Having finally come to a decision, she dashed towards Uraraka again. She caught up to her with 30 seconds on the clock. Uraraka turned and gasped in surprise as Yaoyorozu created a metal rod and shield. Uraraka was looking a little green as Yaoyorozu rushed towards her, ready to strike with her rod. Uraraka let out an undignified "eep." She stumbled to the side to dodge, her steps uneasy. Uraraka turned tail and ran, pushing the bomb in front of her, and Yaoyorozu gave chase. They went through twists and turns, Uraraka guiding the bomb so that it remained several feet away from Yaoyorozu. Many times, Uraraka had to dance around it to avoid sending it crashing into walls. There were 15 seconds left before Yaoyorozu finally caught up to her, her rod striking at Uraraka's legs. Uraraka jumped out of the way, but her landing was uneven, prompting Yaoyorozu to take another swing at her stomach. Uraraka yelped and fell to avoid being hit. Yaoyorozu grabbed for her capture tape, letting go of the rod to do so. Uraraka's hand shot out for it and she rammed it down on Yaoyorozu's foot while she was distracted. Yaoyorozu let out a pained cry as she fell to her knees, dropping the capture tape, which Uraraka grabbed. Before she could tie it around Yaoyorozu, however, a buzzing sound rang out and All Might's voice shouted, "Time's up! The villain team wins!" Almost immediately, the bomb collapsed as Uraraka screamed, "Release!" and hurled. Yaoyorozu stared in bewilderment as Uraraka gasped for breath after she finished, before realizing nausea must be a side effect of her quirk. The two slowly helped each other up and headed downstairs to guide their fallen teammates to Recovery Girl with All Might's permission. 0. With Yaoyorozu unable to guide the conversation, the discussion about who would be MVP of the match was a lot more chaotic, but Izuku saw no reason to intervene. There was only one right answer, though all of them had a lot of room to improve. Kaken would be predictable, he knew that much. He had always loved competition and would likely seek Izuku out for a fight. Izuku hoped to be able to take down Kaken and go after the bomb himself while Todoroki went after Ishido. Hopefully, he would be able to make it look like he was coordinating with Todoroki. All Might called the beginning of the match and they each went their own ways. Izuku made a last-ditch effort to reason with Todoroki. "Look, I have a plan. Kabakugu's gonna come after me, so you can take care of Ishido," he said. Todoroki responded by fixing him with a cold glare. Izuku was unfazed. "I can take care of both of them. Make sure you're not inside at the beginning of the match." Izuku groaned in exasperation before furrowing his brows. Why shouldn't he enter at the start of the match? Soon enough, their intercoms buzzed, signaling the start of the match, and Izuku got his answer. Todoroki stepped forward with his right foot, and ice slowly encased the building. It was truly an impressive display of power. "You idiot!" It was also a stupid one. Todoroki turned to him, confusion sketched across his features. "What do you mean? They can't go anywhere now." Izuku's eye twitched. "One of our opponents has an explosion quirk and the other can secrete acid. Do you really think that they would have any difficulty removing a layer of frost? All you've done is made it harder for me to use my quirk." Todoroki's eyes narrowed slightly. "You won't need to use your quirk, I can do this on my own." Izuku groaned. "Hell." Izuku stalked into the building, the cold seeping into his outfit even before he covered his forearms and calves in fire. He was freezing and angry that he had to blow out so much heat before he had to fight to have any by the time he ran into Kaken. Todoroki paused at the entrance for a while, before walking in as well and turning a different way than Izuku. Izuku huffed a breath as he started searching the first floor. A couple of minutes passed before he moved on to the next. His footsteps were silent, but he did light up the hallways with his flame. It was on the third floor that he heard Kaken. He hesitated before circling around where he heard the noise. Just as he turned the corner, however, heat seared across his back and a loud boom came from behind him. He whirled around just as Kaken started to speak. "You think you can sneak up on me, you demon nerd?" Kaken moved out a large right hook, and Izuku sidestepped, pushing him forward to send him off balance. Kaken didn't even falter, using his explosions to keep himself upright. He turned, moving both hands out, letting explosions loose. Izuku jumped back, arms raised. He blew out a breath, fire billowing out his mouth as flame covered the entirety of his arms and fists. He had to resist the urge to shiver. Shivering wasn't allowed. Kaken turned his arms behind himself, launching himself forward, directly at Izuku. Izuku moved his arm out, a length of flame extending towards Kaken. He twisted midair, undeterred. He crashed into Izuku, and Izuku was sent sprawling, Kaken standing over him. He couldn't lose. It wasn't allowed. Izuku laid his still-lit palm on Bakugo's leg. Kaken hissed through clenched teeth but didn't budge. Instead, he leaned down and let off a stream of explosions in Izuku's face. Izuku saw white walls, blindingly white, and he was so cold. So cold, so hungry. Were they ever going to let him out? Izuku didn't budge either. He breathed out almost all of the heat he had left, aiming directly at Kaken's chest. This time he grunted, finally getting off of Izuku. Izuku exploded upwards, inhaling the flame he had sent at Kaken. He set himself into a fighting stance. Kaken growled. "You've been training to be a hero since you were FNG 4, but you still can't beat me, you nerd. I'm going to be number 1. Izuku let out a wry laugh. It wasn't a nice laugh, it wasn't very reassuring or heroic. "You can have it. I just need a slot in the top 10 to keep up my end of the bargain." Kaken frowned a moment before growling. He seemed a lot more aggressive than he had when they were younger, which was honestly impressive. He charged again. Instead of sidestepping, Izuku ducked under his right hook, aiming a jab at his throat. Kaken dodged just in time. "Failed again, Netsu? TSK. You know that's not allowed." Izuku let out a stream of fire, this time at Kaken's face. Kaken ducked, jamming his foot into Izuku's calf. Izuku cried out and nearly collapsed again. "Oh, Netsu, what happened? I can't believe you fell." The two spent a moment sizing each other up. Both were out of breath and covered in burns, bruises, and cuts. "Guess all that shitty training wasn't useless, GMN nerd?" Izuku huffed a laugh. "Your training hasn't been too bad either, whatever it is." "Ah, shut up and fight, you nerd." Before he even finished speaking, he used his explosions to fly at Izuku again. The flame on Izuku's arms exploded downwards, propelling himself upwards. Kaken's eyes widened as he struck out with his legs, which were still aflame, and clipped the side of Kaken's head. Kaken growled and took a few steps back. All Might's voice rang out over the intercom. "Todoroki Shudo has apprehended a Shido Mina." Kaken snarled. "You can't beat me, Izuku." He raised his palm, his other hand holding the pin to the grenade on his wrist. So those weren't for decoration. Izuku expelled all of the body heat he had left to spare, curling in on himself slightly even as his whole body became encased in fire. "You're crazy, you know. Blow the building down. I'm taking you down with me, though." Kaken chuckled. I guess we'll see." All Might's voice exploded over their comms. "Boys, stop." They both ignored him. The last thing Izuku saw was a blinding white. -0. The silence that had settled over the two of them could almost be described as calm if the air wasn't fraught with tension. Was that Izuku? Kaken asked as he looked across his cot in Recovery Girl's room at Izuku. Izuku kept staring at the ceiling. He'd screwed up. He didn't want to answer. "I call it immolation." He shivered and snuggled further into his sheets. Kaken glared at him a moment before turning his attention back to the wall in front of him. Recovery Girl had given them both strong lectures on the meaning of restraint that had left them both reeling. Neither were eager to speak after that. -0. Izuku went home that day with his head hung low. His trainer for the week was waiting for him when he got there. They pet their head, and it reminded Izuku of a bird. "Hello, Netsu. I hear that you had your first training exercise today. How did it go?" Netsu froze. He couldn't lie. It wasn't allowed. They would know. They always knew. "I never took you for a liar, Netsu. We'll have to rectify that, won't we?" "Well, I won. Both matches I was in." "Oh, is that all?" Netsu flinched. Well, I had to visit the nurse after my second match." His trainer just stared at him for a long moment. Netsu resisted the urge to shiver. He had expelled just about all he had in his fight with Kaken, and he had yet to warm back up entirely. Apparently, Recovery Girl couldn't do much about temperature, given his body was designed to withstand low temperatures. "I suppose we'll have to do some quirk training." Netsu shrank in on himself. This was going to be hellish. -0. Izuku crawled into bed and curled up in a ball. He wouldn't cry. That wasn't allowed. His lips and fingers were blue. His whole body trembled. He had grabbed every blanket he had out of his chest and piled them on. He didn't get much sleep that night. In which a class representative is chosen. The rats were out in full force today. They swarmed the gates of UA, craving any scrap of information they could find. Audacious little creatures. Izuku heard them before he saw them, screeching as they were. They were swarming the gate harassing Aizawa-sensei of all people for information about All Might. Like they would get anywhere with him. He didn't like having to deal with the pests. He'd given a few interviews in the past about growing up in the HPSC and being trained to be a hero before. It was good to get in the spotlight before you even debuted. They had done the same thing with Kigo. Still, they were all vermin who couldn't be trusted, however necessary they were to a pro's career. Izuku squared his shoulders, fixed a sheepish smile on his face, and walked into the crowd of scavengers. 0. It caught Shoyuta slightly off guard. That one of his most unsociable students could be so charismatic. He was prepared to pull Netsu out of the fray but faltered when he saw the confidence set in his shoulders. What can you tell us about having All Might as a teacher? A good-natured chuckle. Well, he's really good at saving people. He's devoted his entire career to it after all. It's been a truly astounding experience having such an amazing person as my heroics teacher. Shoyuta raised an eyebrow. It was certainly astounding to see him so out of his element. The press ate it up, not once to question someone praising All Might. When Netsu was finished with his impromptu interview, a friendly grin on his face, he walked inside the gate. As he passed Shoyuta, he heard his student mumble what sounded suspiciously like, "No sense of boundaries." Friggin' 0. Izuku took a steadying breath before entering the classroom. He still felt chilly, but he wasn't shivering anymore. Not to say he had in the first place. He was the fourth person to arrive again. Kaken, Todoroki, and Ida had gotten there before him. Ida wasn't trying to talk to Todoroki anymore, instead sitting at his seat, gaze fixed on the board at the front of the room. Izuku checked it. There was nothing there. Perhaps Ida was attempting to meet Aizawa-sensei's expectations for when he walked in the door. Perhaps he had zoned out and just happened to be looking at the chalkboard before he did. Perhaps he was seeing things that weren't there. Izuku didn't much care if he was being honest with himself. He didn't feel like talking as he stalked towards his seat. Kaken watched him for a while before turning his attention back to his notes from the day before. Izuku plopped his bag next to his seat and leaned his head against the window. Ida gave him and Kaken a considering look before facing the front of the room again. It felt dismissive. Izuku didn't like it. Students trickled in slowly before Aizawa-sensei entered the room. He looked tired. Izuku couldn't tell whether he was more tired than usual. Izuku didn't see his sleeping bag. Good work on the training exercise yesterday. Aizawa-sensei glared at the class for a second before continuing. Bakugu. Kaken squared his shoulders. You have a lot of talent. Aizawa-sensei's eyes narrowed. Don't waste it. Kaken grunted in affirmation. Aizawa turned to Izuku. Problem child. Izuku made eye contact with his teacher. Was that supposed to be him? Next time, you may want to consider evasive maneuvers. Izuku clenched his fist under his desk. Yes, sir. His voice came out as a whisper. Aizawa-sensei stared at him a bit longer before sighing. On to other matters. Today I need you. Tension and dread spread across the class for reasons that were not quite clear to Izuku. To elect a class representative. As quickly as it had come, it was gone, replaced with relief. Quiet. I want to be representative. Pick me. I'll do it, me. Hey, vote for me. I want to do it. I am the sparkliest of us all. You should choose moi. Izuku lowered his head to his desk, content to let the debate blow over without him, even as Kaken shouted that he should obviously be the class representative since he was the best. Then Glasses had to make it democratic, meaning he'd actually have to participate. Then came the fact that people could vote for themselves. Izuku found that a touch ridiculous, but if the rest of them were fine with it, who was he to protest? Izuku sighed. He'd probably vote for himself. It's what people expected of him, and he didn't want to end up with 0 votes. He was fairly certain no one else would vote for him after his and Kaken's fight the day before. Ida would also be a decent contender, though he was too rigid to be flexible in a time of crisis. Granted, how much crisis would there be at a school of all places? When the papers came around, he wrote his name and turned it into the box that was being passed around. He assumed Yaoyorozu made it. Then the results were written on the board. Yaoyorozu had 3 points, and he and Kirishima both had too. Izuku's eye twitched. Who in their right mind would vote for him? He wasn't leadership material. Before he could react, however, a sheepish chuckle came from the other side of the room. But Netsu's so much smarter and more manly than I am, he can have the vice rep position. Izuku frowned. Nonsense. You're much more, Izuku paused while he searched for the right word, approachable than I am, which is probably more important than intelligence for this particular job. And don't sell yourself short, you're plenty manly, whatever that means. Kirishima looked taken aback. I insist you settle this with a round of rock, paper, scissors. Ida cut in. Izuku shrugged. Kirishima seemed reluctant but agreed nonetheless. The two stood up in front of the classroom so everyone could watch. Izuku knew Kirishima's quirk, or at least its basics. The whole world revolved around quirks. The relationships you formed were centered around quirks, your ability to get a job hinged on having a good enough quirk for it more often than not. Izuku himself loved to analyze them as a hobby even if the suits had added it to his required curriculum. And Izuku knew Kirishima's quirk. Truth be told, he didn't want the position, and he found what Kirishima said about himself worrying. The guy sounded like he needed a pep talk. Izuku would give him the next best thing, the position of vice rep. Izuku knew Kirishima's quirk, and he just knew he wouldn't be so obvious as to go with rock first. Generally, the best strategy was to go with whatever lost to what your opponent expected you to play. That meant if people assumed Kirishima would go rock because of his quirk, he would actually go scissors, which meant all Izuku had to do was choose paper, and Kirishima would be vice rep. Saisho wa gue, Jan ken pon. Kirishima chose rock. Izuku had won. He probably would have, if he had been the type. Instead, he gave a friendly smile. Best of three. Kirishima gave a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Namit, you earned it fair and square. I shoulda known you'd guess I'd pick rock. Then, so quietly Izuku almost didn't hear it, he said, so manly. Soon after, Izuku and Yaoyorozu stood in front of the class as their representatives in the year to come. 0. Lunch came, and Izuku made his way to the rooftop and took off his blazer. He enjoyed eating out there. There were a few others who also came upstairs, but so far there was always a private, quiet corner Izuku could tuck himself away in while he ate his bento. Even almost 20 stories up, he could hear the rustling grass down below, to say nothing of the sky. It was cloudless today. He idly wondered who had voted for him. He was sure he hadn't made a good impression on his class, especially after the battle trials, in particular his fight with Kaken. And yet, he shrugged. It didn't much matter anyway, he was stuck with the position now. Perhaps the suits would be pleased. At the very least, they wouldn't be upset he didn't get a position of some sort in the student government. He basked in the still, calm air, letting all thoughts of the HPSC fade away. His bento had katsudon today. He let himself think of his mother's katsudon, the recipe he ate when he was little. He was startled to find he couldn't remember what it tasted like, only that it had been the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. Then the sirens sounded. Izuku jumped to his feet, lighting his arms and legs with his quirk. The chill that set in both calmed him and filled him with adrenaline. It was a difficult sensation to describe. Was this a surprise training exercise for the heroics course? The few others on the roof were screaming and running for the stairwell. No one would dare to attack Yue, right? He dashed to the railing and looked out at the gate. It had been completely destroyed, practically disintegrated, and the press was scurrying onto school grounds en masse. Beyond that, Izuku narrowed his eyes. There was a man in a black hoodie stalking away. He kept his head low and his shoulders hunched, trying to keep himself as discreet and hidden as possible by the looks of it. That was suspicious. There was nothing he could do about it, however. Looking back down, he could see Aizawa-sensei and Present Mike rush out to greet the media. It seemed there was nothing to be concerned about, so he breathed in his flames and returned to the bench he had been eating at and grabbed his bento and blazer. He would have to calm the others down, he could still hear them screaming. He trekked downstairs, his blazer still in his hand. He found the chokehold where everyone had rushed out of the cafeteria. He breathed out, bright flames flashing above the heads of his classmates. Izuku screamed. Heads swiveled in his direction. Not everyone, but he was sure his words would spread. He breathed his fire back in before he continued, "It's just the press, everything's fine. The faculty are handling it now. Everyone go back to your classrooms and wait, your teachers will explain it there, I'm sure." Izuku nodded to himself, then put on his blazer and started heading back to class. As he swore, he could hear Ida behind him organizing the crowd. Perhaps he would have been a good class rep after all. Maybe Izuku should have voted for him. On the ride home, Izuku pondered about the day's events. He hadn't told anyone about the shady man, though he probably should have. He hadn't thought it was a big deal at the time since it could have just been some vagrant passing by. He decided he would do it tomorrow, see what the staff thought about it. Eventually, things settled down and Class 1A all sat in their seats in front of Aizawa-sensei. There was a nervous energy in the air, and at least a quarter of the class was fidgeting anxiously. "I have a couple of announcements," Aizawa-sensei said. Any in the class who had been distracted focused their attention on Aizawa-sensei. "We'll be going on a field trip tomorrow. Due to the break-in, we'll also be sending you home early. That is all, you're dismissed." The class broke out into chatter, forming groups as they left. Izuku grabbed his backpack and started slowly walking outside. "Netsuko-in," a female voice called out. "Wait up." Izuku turned, pulling his backpack closer to himself. He saw Uraraka chasing after him. Hey," she said once she caught up to him, gasping for breath. "I haven't been seeing you in the cafeteria. Where have you been eating?" Izuku must have made a face because she flushed. I'm asking because I wanted to ask if you wanted to eat lunch with me and Ida. You seem like a pretty calm and smart guy, and I'm sure Ida would like you, especially after the media crisis this afternoon." Izuku's eyes widened. That was new. He had only ever eaten with Kigo, and Kigo was like a brother to him. In fact, legally speaking, he might actually be his brother. Izuku wasn't sure. The HPSC had never bothered to explain it. They were just both pieces of the caretaker initiative. Izuku must have taken too long to answer because Uraraka continued speaking. "That's not to say you don't have to join us," she said, waving her arms frantically. "Oh, no, it's just, I usually eat on the roof, so..." Izuku started looking for an exit. Social interaction was not his strong suit. Uraraka's eyes widened before narrowing. "Oh, well, I'll see you tomorrow." She turned and practically ran back into the classroom, presumably to find Ida. Izuku shrugged and continued on his way. -0. There was no suit waiting for him when he got home this time. He heaved a sigh of relief. There would probably be training later that day, but for now, he finally had time to write his name in a notebook. He hadn't had the chance the night before because, well, when he grabbed one of his personal notebooks and a pencil, he found that when he mentally reached for his name, all he found was blank space. He panicked. That wasn't right. He knew he had asked Kaken just yesterday, and he knew Kaken had answered him truthfully. He remembered it. He remembered how it felt like a missing piece had reinserted itself. He had felt whole again. This had happened to him just yesterday, and the name had already ingrained itself into his soul. And now, where that puzzle piece had been, there was just empty void. There was no way he could have forgotten about it already. At least, not naturally. It had to have been a quirk that did it. It had to have been. He remembered all the appointments he had been to when he had first arrived. He hadn't even known what happened in half of them. One of them must have stolen his name from him. Izuku shoved his face in his pillow and sobbed. His name, his very own name, was stolen, completely gone. He might not even be able to get it back. In which Class 1A visits Universal Studios Japan? Izuku woke up the next day feeling like death warmed over. This wasn't something he could shove in a box and forget about. This was real and it was devastating. His memories of the day before were somewhat distant. He knew his trainers had been disappointed in him for only getting vice rep rather than class rep, but there were no repercussions so far other than distinctly unimpressed looks. While not the worst punishment the HPSC had given him, it always made him feel just that little bit smaller, just that little bit lesser. When he got up the next morning, he didn't feel much better. He was kept awake wondering how much of what he had forgotten was natural, and how much was quirk-induced. He had forgotten his mother's face, what she sounded like, what her katsudon tasted like. Had those things been stolen too, or were they genuinely lost to him over the years? It wasn't like he could ask the suits either. He probably wasn't even supposed to know what happened, and God help him if Izuku got angry at them while talking about it. He would have to shove it to the side and pretend everything was fine, or the suits would get suspicious. He had to go to school and act like nothing was wrong. He recalled Aizawa-sensei's announcement from the day before. There was a field trip today. Hopefully, people would be so distracted with that they wouldn't notice him acting off. And so, when he turned off his alarm at 6 in the morning and began his morning routine, he began to compartmentalize. 0. Yaoyorozu was in the classroom by the time he entered that day. She was reading out of a thick chemistry textbook. He nodded to Kaken as he walked to his desk. Kaken opened his mouth to say something, before apparently thinking better of it and nodding back and returning his attention to his notes. Izuku decided to do the same, leaning the majority of his body weight against the wall as he read over what he wrote in class the day before. It was becoming difficult to stay awake. He had gone 2 nights in a row missing sleep, and it wasn't doing him any favors. He furrowed his brows to look like he was concentrating on his work so he could hide how his eyelids drooped. It didn't take long for all of his classmates to arrive, with Aizawa-sensei following not long after. He didn't have his sleeping bag with him this time. It took you 5 seconds to settle this time. You're improving. His eyes roved the classroom. As I said yesterday, we'll be leaving campus for a field trip today. We'll be doing rescue simulations. You can choose whether to wear your costume or your gym uniform since a lot of costumes' early designs are not properly designed to handle practical scenarios. The shelves of briefcases with their costumes inside slid out of the wall as they had for battle training 2 days prior, seemingly of their own accord. The class stared at their teacher in anticipation. Meet me outside on the buses in 10 minutes. Anyone late will be expelled. Before he had even left the room, the whole class surged forward, all of them heading for their costumes. Ida promptly set to work getting them into lines, grumbles of complaint coming from the crowd. Izuku leaned back in his chair. If Ida was going to do his job for him, being vice representative might just be a cinch. They all safely made it to the buses in costume without having to fear expulsion. Everyone had made it there in under 8 minutes. Classmates chatted excitedly to one another as they boarded the vehicles. Ida, for his part, had been devastated to learn the layout of the buses. Izuku winced in sympathy. 0. Izuku ended up taking a spot towards the front of the bus, hoping to avoid much of the crowd, only for Kaken to take the seat right next to his. Izuku wondered why, given that, for the most part, Kaken seemed to have been avoiding him since their last conversation. DMN nerd, Kaken said. Kaken? Izuku ventured to say. Just shut the hell up, Izuku. Izuku leaned away from him a little. A pit settled in his stomach as he realized that Kaken had no idea how to talk to him. This was bound to be a pleasant experience. If Izuku strained his ears, he swore he could hear a low growl coming from his childhood friend. It seemed his social skills had only deteriorated in Izuku's absence. Thinking about it, Izuku supposed the same could be said about himself. Every so often, Kaken would open his mouth, as if ready to speak, before deciding against it. They continued in this stilted silence until the conversation from the middle of the bus spread to include the two of them. It started with Kirishima making another self-deprecating comment about his quirk, and wasn't that concerning, when someone piped up and said that Todoroki, Kaken, and Izuku had the strongest quirks in the class. Izuku could see Kaken preening at the praise, and Izuku almost did the same, only for Kaken to stop when Kaminari proclaimed his personality to be equivalent to that of a dumpster fire. Kaken's growling spiked in volume as he screamed obscenities at the guy. Izuku almost had to restrain Kaken to keep him from launching himself at Kaminari. Kaminari merely laughed, pointed, and said, "See?" Eventually, Izuku got Kaken to calm down and the bus ride continued in relative calm for the rest of the journey. Kaken didn't try to speak to Izuku after that, his growling still louder than before and his fists clenched in his lap. The two didn't speak to each other the entire time. Kaken wasn't the only one without any idea how to talk to his childhood friend. 0. Whoa! "This looks like Universal Studios Japan," Kaminari shouted. There were a few nods of agreement and amused chuckles from the rest of the class. Aizawa-sensei's whole body seemed to sigh in exasperation at the comment. Indeed, the whole place was a demonstration of opulence and wealth. A large, glass dome covered the building, which included 6 different zones that must have simulated rescue scenarios. Izuku could pick almost every single one out too. There were 2 zones that were covered individually, and going by the decor on the outside, one was fire and one was rain. There was a miniature mountain, the ruins of a city, a landslide, and even the beginnings of a shipwreck. Tsu would likely do well in that zone. Massive steps led from where they were down to a central plaza of sorts with a fountain. 13, who had been standing to the side up to this point, stepped forward. "Welcome to the Unforeseen Simulations Joint, more commonly referred to as the USJ." Uraraka's eyes went wide as saucers, her jaw dropping slightly. Izuku swore he could see stars in her eyes. "Does that 13? She started jumping up and down, and 13 chuckled. She must have been a fan. Izuku wondered if she would become a rescue hero. Her quirk would be well suited to it. "Yes, I am, in fact, the pro hero 13. You might know me for my rescue work. Before we begin, I just want to say one thing. Or 2. Or, well," they started to count on their fingers. Even from behind their mask, 13 managed to look sheepish. From there, 13 launched into a whole lesson on the danger of using your quirk if you weren't careful. Izuku listened attentively, his posture straight and his eyes trained on the hero even though he had already received this lecture before, albeit with a very different tone. Because he was focusing on the hero so much, it was startling to hear one of his classmates interrupt and ask, are those guys part of the exercise?" Izuku looked down at the plaza. A bunch of what honestly looked to be villains were stepping out of a black mist that had appeared down there. Most notably, there was a young man with light blue hair who was covered in hands, and a big, black beast of a man with a beak, his brain exposed. Aizawa saw them too and said, "Those are real villains. 13, get the students out of here, I'll hold them off." Their teacher began to approach the stairs. Izuku blinked. He was fairly certain their teacher wasn't equipped for large fights. The HPSC had given him a few videos of Eraserhead to practice his analysis, and in every one he exercised ambush tactics and sneak attacks, and never confronted large groups without help. Eraserhead didn't specialize in fights with large groups, especially when there were no corners for him to hide around, when there was no backup, and when it was likely to be a long, drawn-out fight. Simply put, if his teacher fought those villains, he would likely die. Izuku started to protest for these very reasons, but Aizawa-sensei cut him off before he could get a word in. "As a hero, you can't be a one-trick pony, kid," he said, before charging down the steps towards the villains. Izuku gulped but allowed himself to be herded away by 13, forcing himself to turn away from Aizawa-sensei's fight. They didn't make it very far. They got 2 steps before the black mist they had seen in the plaza just appeared in front of them. It took Izuku a minute to realize it was a person, even when it began to talk. "I'm afraid I cannot allow you to leave." Yellow eyes gazed down at them, malicious and uncaring. Izuku started to breathe fire at him but had to abort when Kirishima and Kaken ran at the villain, each preparing their own attacks, Kaken going with a right hook as he always did. Some of his mist scattered away from his body, revealing a metal neck brace. Izuku made a mental note of that. Soon enough, however, the void had returned to its previous position, the man controlling it entirely unaffected. "That was close," he said. "I didn't think children would try to fight back, but UA students are known for their tenacity. My job is to scatter you all, that is my purpose." Void rippled out towards them, and Izuku breathed flame at the villain again. Before he could do anything with it, however, mist surrounded them all. Izuku could only see 2 feet in any direction, and the mist was freezing. Izuku couldn't see any of his classmates. "This is it," he thought, "this is how I die." His mind went blank at the thought and his whole body froze. He hoped Kigo would be alright. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the darkness was gone, replaced by a terrible heat and a warm glow. Izuku was falling. As soon as he realized this, He looked down and blew out as much fire as he could in an attempt to slow his descent. He managed to land on his feet without injury, flames already blazing around his limbs as he set himself into a defensive stance. Looking around, he saw he was in what looked like a city completely on fire. The buildings were tall, flames pouring out of the windows. The smell of soot affronted his nose, and heat pressed into him from all sides. There were also about a dozen grinning villains surrounding them. Another second passed, and Shuji appeared through a portal created by the void villain at the entrance and fell to the floor next to him. Shuji glanced up, pushing himself off the ground, and stood back to back with Izuku. It looked like their only choice would be to fight their way out. 0. Fear racked Ida's body, but he couldn't stop. He had to save his classmates. He grabbed as many as he could before getting out of that cold, unsettling fog. He had managed to bring 4 of his classmates with him. 13 had also remained at the entrance, though Ida hadn't had time to get to them. It seemed this dastardly villain wanted them to remain here. At his side stood Jiro, Ashido, Tokoyami, and Siro. 13 looked over to him. Neither class representative was present. Ida looked at his classmates and saw the fear in their eyes. He had to step up in their absence, his peers needed him. Jiro, can you tell if our classmates are still here? He asked. She looked at him, her face determined. She jammed her ear jacks into the floor and a few moments passed before she nodded to him. They're all spread out but still inside the facility. Ida wasn't sure whether that was a good thing. Speedster. 13 called out. I'm trusting you to do this. I need you to run to the school and tell them what's happening. We'll clear the way for you. Ida's eyes widened. I can't just leave my classmates behind. It wasn't 13 who responded. Look, Mr. Rulesman, you're our only way out of this. We're not getting out of this without help, and you're our only chance of getting it, Jiro said. Someone here has a quirk that's interfering with the alarms. Even though Eraserhead is erasing as many quirks as he can, they still haven't gone off. Searching for the culprit would be too time-consuming. We need someone to go tell the others about this situation, 13 continued. Ida was ready to argue, but the others soon chimed in. If you go outside, you can sound the alarms. Ashido called out, clenching her fists and glaring at the black mist. They won't follow you if you leave, so we'll stay and provide support. Siro chimed in. 'Tis a fated battle with the dark, you need not worry for our sakes. Tokoyami somehow managed to say that with the utmost seriousness, and it was admittedly more comforting than Ida would expect. Ida wanted to protest, to stay and help fight, but he couldn't argue with them. He would step up for his classmates. He had to. He would save them all, just like his brother would if he were in Ida's position. He wasn't the class representative, as much as he wished he was. He could do this. He bent his knees and raised his hands, ready to run. 13 began to lay out the plan. 0. Katsuki was beginning to think that Shitty Hair wasn't a complete extra. First, it had been him who had gone to fight Mistfuck with him, and now they were standing back to back as they took down villains. Katsuki was beating more of them, obviously, but Shitty Hair was slowly earning his grudging respect. Finally, after a final cry of, die! It seemed the parade of fuckers that had been stupid enough to think they could beat Bakugo Katsuki ended, and Shitty Hair began to talk. That was so manly, the way you fought and went after that mist guys back there. We should head back to the entrance now, right? I'm worried about the guys still there. If we hadn't charged when we did, 13 could have totally used his quirk to beat that fog guy. We really slowed them down. Katsuki growled. He could hear some dumbass was trying to sneak up on him. If you want to go there, fine. I'm going to kill that warp fucker. Shitty Hair stared at him incredulously. You're gonna act this way even now? What about our classmates? The dumbass made its move. Katsuki slammed the invisible trash into the ground, letting out a steady stream of explosions to keep them down for a while. He was some kind of chameleon mutant who thought he could beat Katsuki. If these are the kind of extras they sent against us, then they should be fine, Katsuki retorted before making his way out of the decrepit building. Besides, he's these guys' getaway. If we take care of him, the other villains will have no way to get out of here before help arrives. Shitty Hair looked at him in awe. Hey Bakugu! Katsuki turned to face him. Believing in your friends, that's real manly. I'm coming with you. Kirishima hardened his arms and slammed them against each other. Katsuki continued walking. 0. Yaoyorozu was stuck on top of an artificial mountain with only Kaminari as backup. The two were quickly cornered by the dozen villains that were already there when the misty villain teleported them to this place. Hey Kaminari, she said, do you remember the battle trials? Kaminari frowned. Yeah, what about? His face lit up in realization. Oh. Yaoyorozu was already creating the sheet when Kaminari charged forward, making contact with as many people as he could and letting loose. When Yaoyorozu peeked out from under her sheet, Kaminari was the only one left standing. She got up, created a metal staff she could use in case she was engaged in combat, and began to herd Kaminari to the entrance. She didn't notice when a man started to walk towards them, having avoided Kaminari's blast. She just barely made it out in time. She pulled Kaminari along by the arm as she ran behind a corner, Kaminari giggling all the while. She kept running. She hoped she would be able to keep this up. She made a mental note to have the heels in her boots removed. This was terrible. 0. Ojiro and Satu were fighters. So when they found themselves in the middle of a city during an artificial rainstorm, they did what they did best. They fought. Ojiro leaped from building to building, picking off villains as Satu faced them head-on. It was tiring, but they slowly worked their way through the villains. Both of them began to feel weary pretty quickly but didn't dare slow down. But these weren't battle simulations. This was the real thing, and they would die if they slowed down. So they fought. On and on. 0. Tsu found herself slightly overwhelmed by Todoroki's power. After pulling him up from the water and getting them both to safety, he calmly placed his right hand against the side of the ship and froze the water underneath them, trapping the villains in place. He then proceeded to make a slide down to them and talk to them. Tsu couldn't make out what he said, but Todoroki seemed to finish his interrogation before walking towards the central plaza. Tsu didn't know how her other classmates were doing, however. She decided to try to head to the entrance instead, mentally wishing her classmate good luck and hoping he didn't get hurt. 0. Uraraka, Koda, and Hagakure were in the middle of a collapsed city center, with brush and rock all around them. It looked like a fake landslide. Rubble lay scattered around them from collapsed buildings, the perfect ammunition for Uraraka's quirk. There were even a couple of tiny birds Koda managed to contact with his quirk. Hagakure had ditched her gloves and shoes. When they had arrived, there had been villains scattered throughout the zone, and the three students resorted to using hit-and-run tactics against them. Koda would act as bait while sending birds to claw at the farthest villains. Anyone who got close to him suddenly found themselves tripping over something they couldn't see, or blindsided by large pieces of concrete, rebar, and the like. 0. Izuku was fairly certain these people had no idea what their quirks were, or he wouldn't have been sent to what appeared to be the conflagration zone, which was wonderfully hot and an endless source of energy for his own flames. He gained heat almost as fast as he spent it, sending whips of flame one after another. It was easy for him to keep their enemies at bay. Any he missed had Shuji to deal with, and what a competent fighter he was. Soon enough, there was almost as much green fire as there was orange. The crowd of villains had been decimated. Izuku looked at Shuji. Let's get out of here and head to the center, yeah? Aizawa-sensei probably needs our help. Shuji looked bewildered. Shouldn't we head to the entrance where 13 was? Izuku went for his best unimpressed look. That's probably what the teachers would want us to do, but Aizawa-sensei doesn't do long drawn-out fights. We have to help him. What about our classmates? Won't they need us? Shuji asked. Besides, it's too dangerous. These villains probably don't know our quirks, or they wouldn't have sent me here. Izuku emphasized his point by making the green inferno behind him look even bigger. The villains we faced weren't even all that skilled. I'm sure they'll be fine if this is all they're up against. As for how dangerous it is, we'll just go see how Aizawa-sensei is doing and maybe pick off some villains on the edges. We won't get involved with the main fight. Shuji deliberated a bit before eyeing Izuku suspiciously. All right, he said hesitantly, Let's go then. Shuji began to lead the way to the center. In which the USJ incident ends. I don't want students getting hurt if I can help it, 13 said. You all just have to stay back. Ida, when I attack you run. There were shouts of complaint from the others, but that didn't matter. 13 would not let them die here. It was bad enough they were sending Ida to run past Kurogiri, they'd rather not risk anyone else if they could help it. Then it all went wrong. 13 was sure, so sure, that their quirk was a perfect counter to this villain, that they could easily SEK them up. They unplugged one of their fingers and aimed at the villain. 13 saw Ida dash away and pride and relief swelled up within them. Then they felt pain explode across their back as a portal opened up in front of them. They heard shouts of horror as 13's own quirk was turned against themselves. The world got a little bit blurrier and a little bit darker as they said, "They got me," and the world turned black. 0. They thought they could kill All Might. These weak villains who had been defeated by a high schooler thought they stood a chance against the #1 hero, the symbol of peace. This wouldn't do. Shudo raced across the ice lake he had created. He was beginning to be able to see his breath. As he ran, he passed heads sticking above the ice here and there. Some were crying out in protest as he escaped, others' teeth were too busy chattering to do so. He was sure Aizawa-sensei was fine, whatever Netsu thought. Still, the sooner he got there, the sooner he could help. The convenient thing was that the shipwreck zone was rather close, and given that he could go in a straight line, it didn't take long for him to get there. When he reached the end of the lake, he found his teacher just beginning to tire, about a quarter to half the crowd taken care of. Despite this, there were still several villains left standing, the most notable of which were the two standing a small distance away from the action, spectating rather than engaging. One had wavy light blue hair and was wearing black clothes and what appeared to be severed human hands, and the other was a big black beast of a thing that towered over the other. It had a large, yellow beak, and its brain was exposed. Thinking quickly, Shudo froze the ground underneath everyone except his teacher, taking care to make it extra thick around the two he had noticed. Aizawa-sensei straightened immediately, head methodically turning as he searched for the cause. Despite Shudo's expectation of praise, when Aizawa-sensei finally caught sight of him, his teacher only glared. At least, from what Shudo could tell behind his goggles. He didn't have long to do so because the villain that looked to be covered in hands started talking. Well, the new player has logged on, a raspy voice said. Nomu. Aizawa-sensei had already whipped around and charged at the one who spoke. Shudo looked up to see the villain, the one who appeared to be in charge of this shoddy operation, staring straight at him. He casually leaned down and pressed his hands against the ice holding him in place, and Shudo watched it slowly disintegrate. Attack the teacher. The villain giggled, grinning a grin too wide for his mouth as, before there was time to blink, Aizawa-sensei was slammed into the concrete floor by the hulking thing that had been standing next to the man just a split second before. A bloody puddle beginning to form underneath him, he tried to sit back up, only for the beast to grab his head, the entirety of which fit neatly in its hand, and smash it into the concrete. While Shudo stared on in shock, the lead villain lunged at him. Shudo threw as much ice as he could in the way, but the villain disintegrated it in seconds. Shudo dodged to the side just in time to avoid the same fate as his ice, but he swore he could feel a single finger brush across his arm as he did so. Months, maybe even weeks or days later, he would look back on this moment and shudder. At the time though, he couldn't afford the luxury. Shudo chastised himself in his head. He shouldn't have gotten involved with his teacher's fight. Now Aizawa-sensei was being restrained and bleeding on the floor while Shudo ran for his life. Thoughts of his father began to enter his mind before he placed them in a steel trap and removed them. Now was not the time to think of him. There was a fight he needed to win. 0. The students stared in horror as 13 fell to their knees and Ida slowed down to a stop. Time seemed to pass more slowly as the back of their costume, what remained of it at least, fell with the hero. Tokoyami was the first to break out of his stupor as Kurogiri rocketed towards Ida to stop him. Dark Shadow! Tokoyami shouted, and his quirk burst forth and inserted itself between the villain and their classmate. It clawed at the villain, screeching and screaming. Kurogiri tried to go around to no avail. The rest seemed to shake themselves awake, and Ashido ran towards the fallen pro and slung acid towards the villain as she went. Ida kept running. Kurogyri growled and dodged as Jiro stuck her jacks in the floor and activated her quirk. A low, fluctuating hum emanated from the speakers on her boots. It wasn't doing much except maybe annoying the people on the battlefield, but Tokoyami didn't have time to wonder about it. Kurogyri lunged at Ida again, but Dark Shadow shielded him as Siro shot tape out of his arms to stop him. It landed on the metal brace that they had seen earlier and effectively rendered him unable to continue his advance. Siro was then essentially locked in a tug-of-war with Kurogyri, his whole body tense under the strain. Siro had more training in agility than he had in strength, and it was beginning to. Tokoyami was about to call for Dark Shadow to help, his quirk already moving towards the tape before he said anything, when a loud snap was heard. The tape had broken close to Siro's elbows and Siro fell to his knees, gripping his tape dispensers. His face was tight with pain. Kurogyri put up a wall of mist to separate the students, leaving just Tokoyami to defend Ida. That was when the villain seemed to come apart at the seams. The hum from Jiro's quirk was more steady now, and Kurogyri groaned in pain. The wall began to look like Swiss cheese, one of the holes revealing a wide grin on Jiro's face. I thought I heard something coming from whatever attack you used to send our classmates away. I figured I just had to match the frequency of that and phase it out a little and your quirk would stop working, she said. Luckily you emit the same sound, and so did that wall you tried to put up, so finding it was easy. Tokoyami wondered if the villain actually heard any of that. He seemed to be splitting apart, pieces of himself separating and disappearing, and his brace from before remained on full display. He looked so much smaller. Tokoyami turned to look for Ida, his eyes just catching him as he opened the door and sped away. He looked back at 13. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief because Ida might save them or dread because 13 still hadn't stirred. 0. Shudo was terrified. He had often thought sparring with his father was reminiscent of fighting for his life, but now that he was experiencing what that actually felt like, training seemed like an enjoyable pastime in comparison. Every iceberg Shudo sent the villain's way turned to snow, causing the man, if he could even be called that yet, to cackle madly. Ice was beginning to spread across his right side and he could see his breath. Shudo was starting to think he might just lose this fight. He didn't like to think about the implications if that were to happen. Maybe he should use no. He promised himself he'd never resort to that. But then there was fire all over the battle scene, a wall separating Shudo from the villain chasing him, melting the ice that covered his right side, and he was so scared that he had lost control, so worried he had accidentally and instinctively broken his own promise to himself. What was odd, though, was that the fire was green. Last Shudo had checked, his quirk produced normal orange flames. Then again, it had been a while since he had last used it. He supposed there was an astronomically low chance it mutated in that time. A much more likely explanation, however. A quick glance around the plaza confirmed his suspicions. There was Netsu, fighting off 3 of the extra villains at once, all while shielding Shudo from the man who disintegrated his ice. He was followed by a positively consternated Shuji, if he remembered his name correctly, who was fighting off anyone who dared to get close to Netsu. At first, Shudo felt offended that they thought him incapable of defending himself. Thinking it over a bit more, however, he realized he was grateful for the second chance to save his teacher. Aizawa-sensei still hadn't moved from the floor, and the beast still hadn't let go. 0. Tokoyami's uncertainty over how to feel didn't last long. Just as they had a chance at winning, Kurogyri managed to create a portal underneath Jiro's feet just long enough to send her some unknown place with a surprised yelp. The students stood petrified while the villain regathered himself. Well, he said, that was close. Thankfully, she won't be a problem anymore. Now, shall we continue? He had barely finished speaking before he attacked Tokoyami, apparently deeming him the largest threat present. Tokoyami couldn't react in time, but Dark Shadow could. He lashed out at the villain, clawing and scratching at him as best he could. Siro grimaced in pain and started to shoot tape again, once more trying to restrain Kurogyri. The villain wasn't underestimating them anymore though, and dodged every attack Siro sent his way. Ashido stood, glaring as she chucked lobs of acid at him. When he started creating portals to send them back at her, she dodged by skating around on acid produced by her feet. Tokoyami joined the onslaught, and while Kurogyari seemed to be tiring, it wasn't nearly fast enough for Tokoyami's taste. At the rate they were going, they were most certainly going to run out of energy before he did. Tokoyami only hoped Ito would be fast enough. 0. Izuku felt a little bad for breaking his promise to Shuji. Then again, he hadn't actually promised his classmate anything. He had gone back on his word, though, and that made him feel guilty. He still couldn't exactly say he regretted his actions. Who knows how long Todoroki had left, and just glancing at Aizawa-sensei made him feel queasy. He may not exactly trust authority figures, but the blood pooling underneath Aizawa-sensei filled him with unease. He made sure to keep the fire as far away from him as possible. That left the issue of the thing sitting on top of him, but Izuku could see Todoroki moving to take him down. Based on what looked, from a distance, like snow laying around them, Todoroki had tried and failed to do something like that already. The lesser villains around them had been decimated in minutes, and soon it was just Izuku, Todoroki, Shuji, and the lead villain, as well as Aizawa-sensei and his captor. For the first time in his life, Izuku wished he had had more training. 0. Ito was running as fast as he could. He was about halfway to UA when he ran into All Might. The hero was surprised to see him at first, but he was serious and attentive as Ida gave the rundown of the situation as succinctly as he could. It wasn't as concise as he would have liked, but he didn't have time to concern himself over it. All Might didn't hesitate before he responded, "Head back to UA and inform Principal Nedzu of this. Continue on to the USJ. You're doing well, but you must keep running." Ida nodded, and did as the hero asked, not even looking back at Japan's #1 hero. He was a man on a mission of the utmost import. He found himself beginning to tire as he continued, but he didn't dare slow down. It didn't take too much longer to come upon the iconic UA building. 0. Izuku and Shuji took care of the last of the minor villains quickly while Todoroki quietly and slowly approached Aizawa-sensei. The villain covered in hands fixed Izuku with a murderous scowl. "You little sheet," he said. "Nomu." Todoroki stopped sneaking towards Aizawa-sensei. "Kill the green-haired brat." Acting quickly, Izuku shoved Shuji as far out of the way as he could, sending half his fire to block Shuji from running back towards him and the other half between him and the monster. The Nomu, as it was called, barreled straight through his flames and ran into him like a freight train, knocking him to the floor much the same way as it had Aizawa-sensei. He could feel his grip on his fire disappear, and his flames with it. The world spun. The Nomu raised its fist to hit him again, and Izuku breathed as much fire into its face as he could. The Nomu reeled back, roaring, and Todoroki froze it in place. Izuku scrambled away and tried to get hold of his bearings. His chest hurt, and he wondered about the state of his ribs. His trainers would be upset if he broke any. Shuji grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him out of the way of the Nomu, who had broken out of the ice and charged at him again. Izuku belatedly realized that Shuji was yelling his name and that he was very, very cold. Todoroki sent another blast of ice at the thing chasing Izuku, this time covering his whole body instead of just his legs. Izuku searched for any of his warmth he had left on the battlefield. Finally, he found it in the air above where he was pinned before, a fraction of what it once was after Shuji shoved him out of the way. Immediately, he breathed it all in and reveled in the feeling of being able to feel his fingers again. "Nomu, stop." The hand villain Shudo. The Nomu froze in place, returning to his position from the beginning of the attack. "I'll take care of that brat myself. Stop the other one from interfering." With that, Izuku was caught in a dazed battle with the leader while Todoroki tried to stop the Nomu from killing Shuji. 0. Sue wasn't sure what she was expecting to see once she reached the entrance, but it most certainly wasn't her teacher, a licensed pro hero, in pieces on the floor with a small handful of her classmates fighting off the villain that had scattered them all earlier. 13 lay face down on the floor, their back completely missing, the hero possibly dead, while Ashido danced around throwing acid at the missed villain, Siro his tape in the villain's way, and Tokoyami maintained a frontal assault. From what she could tell, the villain hadn't noticed her yet. She sensed an opportunity to hopefully turn this situation around. Making sure to time it correctly, just as Kurogiri dodged one of Suro's attacks, she leaped over her classmates, wrapping her tongue around the villain's metal brace as she landed on the wall of the USJ, using it as a springboard as she launched herself in a different direction and dragged Kurogiri with her. She felt something scratch at her tongue, but she kept a tight hold of her captive as she jumped from place to place and hopefully disoriented her captive. He shouted and cried every time she changed direction, so she felt she was on the right track. After what felt like minutes passed, and she felt he had finally had enough, her classmates watching in awe, she slung him towards the plaza, hoping her teacher would be better able to handle him than her. She turned to look at her 3 classmates, who all stared back at her for a few heartbeats. She tasted blood, and stretched out her tongue, only to flinch when she went too far. Tokoyami's eyes widened when he saw the bleeding scratch on her tongue. "Oh no," he said, "it appears Dark Shadow scratched you as you took hold of that villain. You have my deepest apologies, Azui." He lowered his head and closed his eyes. "It's alright, Carol. You didn't mean to, and it doesn't hurt that badly. When we get out of this, it'll heal in no time." Tsu didn't smile. She often felt disingenuous when she did so, and this time was different. "And call me Tsu, Karo." Tokoyami jumped back a little. Okay." Quieter, he said, "Thank you, Tsu." Tsu nodded. "Shouldn't we go help our classmates or something? We may have taken care of our villain, but the others might be in danger." Ashido said, her fists waving in the air and her face concerned. "You need to stay up here where it's safe." It was a hollow-sounding voice that spoke. 13 was still alive. Every word sounded like a struggle. The 4 of them jumped. "You're still awake? What can we do?" Zero asked, his voice high in both volume and pitch. 13 groaned. Zero shrank into himself a little. Ashido ran and kneeled by their side, grabbing hold of their hand. "What can we do for you?" she quietly asked. "Just stay here. No student is dying under my watch." The students looked at each other. Ashido turned back to 13 and whispered, "Okay. 0. Of course things just had to get harder, Izuku thought as the portal villain from before literally fell out of the sky and into the plaza. Before, they had at least outnumbered the villains behind this 3-2. Even then, they were struggling to survive. Now, their numbers were even. These people weren't like the thugs they had already defeated. Izuku was sure they would need a numbers advantage to get out of this alive. At first, Kurogiri looked somewhat discombobulated from his flight. Izuku tried to attack within that time, but the leader came at him from a different angle, taking all of his attention. He was fighting injured and without enough warmth to create a large inferno like he had before. The most he could produce was about the size of a campfire. "Shigaraki Tamura," Kurogiri said once he had gathered himself. "So that was the leader's name. One of the students has escaped and is currently heading to get help. Time is of the essence. I suggest we leave while we can." But before anyone could react, Kaken literally exploded onto the scene, the most deadly glare Izuku had ever seen on his face. He landed on top of Kurogiri, who obviously tried to break free. Kaken unleashed his quirk directly onto his metal neck brace. "Don't you dare if you move, mistfucker. Don't think I didn't notice this stupid FANG thing when I first attacked you. If you move 1 centimeter, I'll blast this shitty metal to bits." He was grinning ear to ear. It looked more like he was baring his teeth. Kirishima, who was following slightly behind him, muttered something about him not behaving very heroically. Well, Izuku thought, now it's 5-3. There are technically worse odds. Shigaraki was scratching at his neck, and angry mutters reached Izuku's ears. He could just see red appearing under the man's nails before he suddenly stopped, putting his fists at waist level like a petulant child. "Kurogiri, if you weren't our ride out of here, I'd kill you myself," he growled as he turned his attention towards Katsuki. "And you?" Shigaraki snarled as he flew towards Kaken, who only grinned in response. Before Shigaraki could reach him, Izuku moved all his fire in the villain's path. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. Kirishima burst through, his whole body hardened, and aimed a punch for Shigaraki's face. Shigaraki merely grinned and raised a hand. "No!" Izuku shouted. 5 fingers closed around Kirishima's fist, and Kirishima yelped before kicking Shigaraki in the stomach and dashing away. He softened the injured hand, and the flesh was pink and red, like an especially angry road rash, but it looked like it would heal in good time. Relief washed over Izuku. Shigaraki growled menacingly. Izuku heard a shout behind him. Whirling around, he saw the Nomu had grabbed Shuji by the legs and was dodging every ice burst Todoroki sent its way, swinging Shuji wildly in the air as he did so. Izuku felt a large palm push against his back as another hand held his arm, keeping him in place. The blood drained from his face as he realized who grabbed him. Oddly enough, however, he felt no pain at either contact point. Shigaraki's low chuckle sounded from right behind Izuku. "You really are so cool, Eraserhead," the villain said. Izuku turned to his teacher, who had propped himself on his elbows, a red glow coming from his goggles as they pointed at Shigaraki. The villain spoke again. "I wonder, how long can you keep that up?" Shigaraki giggled, and moved to place his right palm against Izuku's chest and with his other hand grabbed both of Izuku's wrists, and held them behind Izuku's back before Izuku had time to break free. "You motherfucker!" Kaken shouted from his place on top of Kurogiri. Kirishima started running in their direction. Kurogiri seized the opportunity to fling a distracted Kaken off of him while opening a portal underneath Kirishima's feet that spat him out high up in the air near the top of the dome, and Kirishima was falling. Kaken tried to attack Kurogiri, but every explosive punch he threw was teleported perilously close to Todoroki, who was doing his beat to dodge while trying to save Shuji. Kaken was screaming in incoherent rage. Through it all, Kirishima had hit the ground and groaned, but didn't get back up, and Izuku was still being held by Shigaraki, and Aizawa-sensei was beginning to groan from the effort of keeping his eyes trained on the villain. They were losing. A loud crash sounded from the entrance, followed by a booming voice proclaiming, "Fear not, dear students, for I am here." The action in the plaza ground to a halt. Even the Nomu stopped running and just held tight to Shuji. Izuku looked in that direction and relaxed under Shigaraki's hold, which had loosened. All Might wasn't smiling. Shigaraki was the first to speak. "Nomu." It immediately dropped Shuji, who grunted on impact. Every attempt he made to get up was halted by his imbalance. Shigaraki didn't get to say anything else to the creature before suddenly the 5 students and Aizawa were on the sidelines. All Might stood between them and the villains. "You 5 take your teacher to the entrance. I'll handle these villains," All Might said before leaping into battle. Shigaraki ordered the Nomu to kill All Might and Kurogiri went to stand next to Shigaraki. All Might was moved into a battle with the Nomu while the other 2 villains watched. Izuku was struck by the memory of watching the man, the legend of a hero, on the news daily when he was little, before the HPSC took him. He recalled hours upon hours sitting on his old couch and watching interviews and fights and commercials, all dedicated to the hero before him. He remembered always wanting to hear the man's slogan in person, maybe even be saved by All Might himself. He felt a rush of excitement as his old love for the hero was rekindled. He may not have stars in his eyes like he did when he was younger, but he remembered the respect and adoration he had felt when he was younger. Before Izuku could settle too long on these feelings, Kaken pulled him away as Kirishima, wincing, helped Shuji stand and Todoroki looked Aizawa-sensei over. Their teachers seemed to have officially lost consciousness. The sound of All Might's fight began to reach their ears. "Todoroki," Izuku said, "would you mind creating a small fire for me? My quirk uses my body heat and I used a lot of it." Todoroki stiffened and Kaken furrowed his brows at Izuku, but soon enough there was a small fire in Todoroki's left hand that Izuku kept close to. It wasn't the quickest way to warm up, but it was the beat Izuku had at the moment. By that point, Shuji had Aizawa-sensei mounted on his back with Kirishima holding him steady. "Come on guys, All Might can easily win this. Let's head back to the entrance, all right?" Kirishima said. The others all agreed and began their trek towards the step. Izuku's chest pain was beginning to grow as they walked, and he calmed down. They were a quarter way up the stairs when Izuku heard Shigaraki laugh maniacally behind him. The group turned and saw that the Nomu had All Might caught in a suplex. Kurogyari had portals primed to bisect the hero. Todoroki's flame disappeared as he used his right foot to step forward, and a trail of frost covered the ground until it reached the Nomu, covering the monster in ice all the way up to his wrists, leaving All Might free to escape its grasp. The Nomu broke free seconds later and re-engaged All Might in their brawl. Kirishima, help Shuji take Aizawa-sensei to the entrance. Us three are going to stay and help where needed, Izuku ordered. Kirishima looked affronted. But Izuku let go of Kaken to stand straight on his own. Don't argue with me, Kirishima. Shuji needs to get Aizawa-sensei to safety, now, and he needs you to keep him steady and defend him if necessary. Go! Izuku was ready to pull rank on him, but Kirishima just frowned and did what Izuku asked. The three turned and started running towards the center of the USJ. The pain in Izuku's chest began to fade again. They were far enough away that they couldn't make out the conversation happening on the plaza. As they approached, All Might shouted something along the lines of, "Then I'll just have to go beyond 100%. Plus ultra." The Nomu was sent flying after a barrage of punches hit his stomach, with an uppercut to finish it off. The three halted in their advance, stopping at the edge of the plaza. "Well," said Todoroki's dry voice, "looks like All Might has the situation under control." The boy turned and started walking towards the stairs. He didn't bother waiting for the other two. Kaken tried to grab Izuku's arm, but Izuku pulled away. There was some kind of steam all over the battlefield. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. It looked like it was coming off All Might's body, but that didn't make any sense. There was no reason for that to happen. If there was an unknown on the battlefield, Izuku knew better than to ignore it. Something was wrong. Well, evildoers? Damn it. You can't possibly expect to win now. I suggest you leave while you have the chance, All Might said. All Might was known for his radiant smile. Izuku hadn't ever known him to not be smiling. It turned out the hero was extraordinarily intimidating without it. Yet Izuku's mind kept furiously puzzling over the origin of the steam. Kaken began to get more insistent with his tugs. "Listen, ya diamond nerd, we need to get you to the entrance so someone can fix your sheet." He started, trying to bodily pull Izuku away. No, not yet. Something isn't right, Izuku responded as he shoved Kaken away. Kaken didn't try to grab Izuku again, but he knit his brows in confusion. Huh? The F, you mean, something isn't right? I mean, where is the steam coming from, and why is All Might bothering to scare them away instead of taking care of them? This doesn't feel right, Izuku responded, his voice low so the villains couldn't hear. Kaken's face became painted with realization, and he began to watch the scene unfold with intense focus. Izuku did the same, subtly breathing out fire and keeping it behind his back so no one would see. Kurogyari murmured something to Shigaraki, who growled in turn. A few seconds of calm passed as the two deliberated over their options. Without any forewarning, Shigaraki surged forward, his hand outstretched and fingers splayed, and Izuku sent what fire he had summoned around the man's hand, not bothering to concern himself over possibly giving the man a nasty burn scar. He tried to kill Izuku, to kill All Might. Shigaraki screeched when the fire wrapped around him, high-pitched and astonishingly loud. He turned to Izuku, his bloodlust evident in his features. He was just about to attack Izuku when several gunshots rang out throughout the USJ. Shigaraki fell back, blood seeping from his knees and an elbow. Kurogyari opened a portal underneath him and the two disappeared as quickly as they had come. Izuku spun around and saw Ida standing proudly next to a large portion of the UA faculty including Principal Nedzu. Snipe-sensei stood to the side and fired a good many rounds to various zones throughout the USA. The other heroes dispersed, spreading out to rescue students around the facility. Present Mike-sensei rushed down to help Kirishima and Shuji up the last few steps, worrying over Aizawa-sensei. Izuku made a mental note of their friendship, if that's what it was. Izuku and Kaken began to approach All Might, only to be blocked by a concrete wall erupting from the ground. Cementos walked over and said, "You two are needed at the entrance." His eyes narrowed at Izuku. "Especially you." There are ambulances outside to take care of anyone who is injured and police to take your statements. Kaken grumbled and started walking away, stopping when Izuku didn't follow. Izuku regarded the pro before nodding in acquiescence and catching up to Kaken. Kaken grabbed his arm and slung it over his shoulder. "I'm not a cripple," Izuku said. "Oh, shut up you FING nerd. You've obviously been beaten to sheet, and I'm not going to sit here and wait for a demon idiot to get over himself and accept some effing help." Kaken was scowling. Izuku felt a little touched. His chest was hurting a lot and he was sure something was broken. It began to settle on him, then, that it was over, that he was safe, that he didn't have to fight for anyone's life anymore. He saw most of his classmates being ushered out of the building by heroes with only minor bumps and bruises. His mood dampened when he saw Kaminari desperately clutching Yaoyorozu to his chest until a teacher was finally able to take her from him when they were out the door. Her right leg was an angry red, various lines crawling from inside her boot to midway up her thigh. She was conscious, though, and speaking coherently. Izuku hoped she was okay. It wasn't long before he was taken to his own ambulance, an annoying doctor poking at various places on his chest and abdomen. As irritated as he was, Izuku waited patiently for them to finish. It was decided that he would be taken to the nurse's office so Recovery Girl could see to him. Kaken was reluctant to leave Izuku, but he was herded onto the bus they arrived in with the rest of the uninjured students, where they would be taken to the school entrance to wait for their parents. Aizawa-sensei, 13, Yaoyorozu, Kirishima, and Izuku were all taken in ambulances to Recovery Girl. Izuku couldn't be bothered to wonder what the suits would think of his performance as he drifted to sleep while riding in the ambulance, the battle having absolutely exhausted him beyond how tired he had already felt when he had arrived at the USJ. In which class 1A recovers? A slight man clad in black and white walked up to the driver of the ambulance which was carrying one of his charges. He went largely unnoticed in the crowd. After all, his charge hadn't been the only one of the students injured, though the severity of his injuries was cause for alarm. The man leaned inside the driver's side window and whispered simple, discreet words. He didn't need a response from the person, so he walked away before he got one, off to meet the driver where he told them to go. 0. Our next story covers a recent villain attack on UA High. Yes, you heard that right. UA High School, the nation's most prestigious hero academy, renowned for its excellent security and the high-quality heroes that make up its alumni, has been attacked by villains. Yaoyorozu's leg felt a bit numb as Recovery Girl cleared her to leave. While there was a noticeable limp for the time being, there wouldn't be any scarring, thanks to her quirk, so the only lasting damage was perhaps to her pride. She kept trying to tell herself that she was still in training and that she had gone up against an actual villain, but she still felt so disappointed in herself for not being able to save Kaminari herself. It had been a magnificent slide of luck. Jiro had appeared when she did, showing up behind the electric villain and blasting him away with her speakers, but not before he had managed to grab Yaoyorozu's leg and electrocuted her. Yaoyorozu sighed as she got in the back seat of the family car, the driver taking her straight home to her parents. She would be needing so much tea after this. The attack happened at the Unforeseen Simulations Joint, known as the USJ for short, while a first-year class was there on a field trip. Several students and even a few members of faculty were injured. Recovery Girl was so manly. All it took was one kiss, and all of Kirishima's bruising was gone. Sure, the tiredness her quirk left him combined with the down of coming off that adrenaline rush left him exhausted, but nothing a little sleep wouldn't fix. His mom had come to pick him up after having to file various paperwork at the administration office. She worried over him a bit before walking him back to their house, where he immediately stumbled to bed and didn't stir until the next day, when he was absolutely ravenous. The villains belong to an organized group that call themselves the League of Villains. This seems to be a bold debut by their group as a whole, and reports say they intend to kill All Might. Shuji didn't have to take long in the infirmary. He was more worried about Aizawa-sensei and All Might. Aizawa-sensei had quickly been shuttled to a nearby emergency room while the students and All Might were taken to the infirmary at UA. However, All Might was kept out of view the entire time, and even now, he was kept in another room. Shuji hoped his injuries weren't severe. As for himself, most of his damage had been caused by having been gripped tight and shaken around like a rag doll by the largest of the villains. There was terrible bruising on the outside of his legs, and he had been feeling very spacey, but Recovery Girl had healed the majority of it. He got a particularly concerned look from her as she noticed his head injury, which she changed into a dull if insistent headache after her care. The person he was most curious about was Netsu, who was supposed to join them at the infirmary before his ambulance was apparently redirected to some HPSC facility. Given the look on her face when she was told about it, it wasn't on Recovery Girl's orders. It was definitely weird. Why would Netsu be sent to the HPSC of all places? But Shuji decided he wouldn't dig. It wasn't his place, it wasn't his business. In fact, the attack has been rumored to be an attack on All Might specifically, who was able to arrive just in time to prevent anything too serious from happening. Tashinori was driving himself into a pit of frustration. What was he thinking, using all his time in his hero form on his way to where he needed it most? If he hadn't been such an idiot, things might have turned out better. It was quiet in the little room in which he was sequestered, but it was also a little lonely. Thankfully, that loneliness was soon interrupted by Naomasa, and the two had a nice, long chat. If anything, this incident proved to All Might that wouldn't be able to keep this up for long. He needed to find a successor, and fast. Despite that, if UA's security failed this time, what's to stop it from happening again? This event most certainly calls into question the ability of UA to take care of its students, and we'll be keeping an eye on them after this incident. Now, as for the weather, Katsuki turned off the news. He was usually said, but this level of fury was beyond that and had been for a while. Normally, he was able to express his constant frustration through well. He had never been exactly communicative about anything. At least, not in any sort of intelligible way. He had always preferred to let his fists and his quirk do the talking. Katsuki huffed a breath. Since his disappearance, a very large part of Katsuki's reason for becoming a hero had become finding Izuku. After he had been taken, Katsuki had been left adrift. The only person Katsuki could stand to be around was gone, with no real explanation as to why, and every parental figure in his life just as distraught as him. He accomplished that goal much sooner than he could have hoped. There was a problem. Katsuki had never put much thought into saving Izuku beyond locating and extracting him, but he certainly hadn't expected Izuku to be so blank. Looking back, Katsuki realized that a lot of the ideas he had developed over the years regarding his childhood friend were almost childish. Katsuki, if he had put any thought into it at all, might have believed Izuku to be in a sort of limbo or stasis, just waiting to be allowed back home with Katsuki and Auntie, and once he returned order would be restored and all would be as it was and it would be like nothing ever happened. Katsuki knew now that was never going to happen, and it would be FING stupid to think otherwise. So he was left at a bit of a loss as to what to do. His decision, then, was to save Izuku. Really save him. How he would go about doing that, Katsuki wasn't entirely sure yet. A scant few times, he had considered asking his parents or Auntie what to do. He squashed the thought as quickly as it came. Asking them what to do would mean telling them he found Izuku, and while he wished he could proclaim his friend's return, he couldn't. Izuku wasn't saved yet. How could he go to them, raise their hopes like that, see a light he hadn't seen in their eyes in years return, only for them to realize how much Izuku had changed, to realize that he was still as unattainable as ever, firmly stuck in the HPSC's grasp. It doesn't matter that they knew where he was now, they weren't that much closer to bringing him home. Even if they could, it wouldn't be the Izuku they knew, bright and smiling and effervescent and better than Katsuki could ever be, as much as Katsuki had tried to pretend otherwise. Katsuki shook his head. He was tired. He was angry. He didn't particularly feel like talking to anyone. So he did what he always did whenever he felt like this and went to the small workout room that had taken over the guest bedroom, letting his frustration out on a punching bag built to better withstand his quirk. -0. Hawks was currently engaged in a rather tedious phone conversation with Kanto-sensei from his office at his hero agency. Kanto-sensei was a member of whatever board was in charge of the caretaker initiative. More specifically, he was in charge of Kigo and Izuku's physical well-being. Every doctor the two saw deferred to him, though he only showed himself if one of them were in critical condition like Izuku was now. He was a rather spindly sort of man, tall and thin. He always wore a stark white lab coat over a pitch-black turtleneck sweater and pants, vaguely dark wireframe glasses over startling white eyes, his medium-length dark hair greased back behind his ears and out of his face. All Kigo currently wanted from the man was permission to see Izuku in whichever infirmary they had stuck him in, but Kanto-sensei refused to tell him where Izuku was until Mara permitted him to take a short leave. The issue was that Mara, who, while he had been more involved with Kigo's career after he had graduated, was still aloof and hard to get into contact with given how he always had so much other work to do. Honestly, Hawks, little Netsu's not even awake yet. Your presence would accomplish nothing. Kigo's fist tightened. Kanto-sensei noticed and sighed in disappointment. Look, how about a compromise? I make sure you're called when he does wake up and you get back to work. Deal? Kigo forced his hands and his posture to relax, easing into his laid-back persona. It wasn't quite what he was after, but he could recognize that it was the best he was going to get. He nodded at Kanto-sensei. When the man nodded back, effectively dismissing him, Kigo went back to work. 0. Izuku woke up, slowly, in what he was fairly certain was a bed. He could feel the linen sheets covering him, a soft pillow under him, and the weight of his eyelids was great enough he didn't bother lifting them for a long time, content to take in the sounds around him. There wasn't much. He could hear a consistent beep close by, almost as calming in its rhythm as it was annoying in its shrillness. There were occasional muffled footsteps, perhaps even muffled chatter. There was no other discernible noise to Izuku besides that. Eventually, though, Izuku felt rested enough to crack open his eyes, only to shut them tightly again at the force of the bright white light that surrounded him. Slower this time, he opened them again, letting his eyes adjust to the light. Looking around, he recognized the room to be an HPSC infirmary such as he had woken up in several times since he had become an asset of the caretaker initiative. He looked to his right to find the button to notify the nurse and pressed it. In less than a minute, a woman arrived in completely white clothing with red hair in a short, tight ponytail and green eyes that looked him over, slender hands jotting things down on her clipboard. Izuku stared at her in the meantime. After she had gotten whatever information she needed, she left the room and shortly thereafter returned, this time with a small plastic cup in each hand. One held 2 unassuming white pills inside and the other was filled with water. She handed both to Izuku, who took the medicine without question. He swallowed and opened his mouth for the nurse to check. Once she made sure he really had swallowed the pills, he returned the 2 cups and she left without a word. It didn't take Izuku long to fall back asleep after that. 0. Kigo was surprised to have actually been told Izuku had woken up and less surprised to find the medical staff confused as to why he was visiting the kid. Still, they didn't deny him access to Izuku's room, and Kigo soon found him asleep. Kigo didn't find that surprising either. He doubted Izuku had been awake for 5 minutes before drifting off again, either because of his own exhaustion or more chemical means. Kigo found a chair and set it up next to Izuku's bed, placing a feather in the crack between the door and its frame to let him know if someone came his way. He ended up following Izuku's lead without meaning to, dozing off in his chair. 0. Izuku hated waking up feeling this heavy. Opening his eyes seemed like a feat of strength, let alone moving an arm, and he could forget about sitting up anytime soon. Still, he managed to open his eyes, and it didn't take long for them to land on a sleeping Kigo. Suddenly, getting upright seemed much more manageable. Shooting upwards, Izuku shouted, "Kigo-san," before promptly careening back down, a hand clutching at his forehead as his head made its displeasure at having risen in elevation so quickly known. At Izuku's exclamation, Kigo jumped out of his chair, his gaze eventually falling on Izuku. He frowned and quietly asked, "You okay, kid?" Izuku nodded slightly, eyes shut tight. The two sat in silence for a while until Izuku slowly let go of his head and looked back at Kigo, who was watching him carefully. "Did I wake you up?" Izuku asked. Kigo blinked. "Oh, yes, but I'm glad you did." The whole point of me coming here was to keep you company when you woke up. I didn't even mean to fall asleep. Izuku stared at him doubtfully before saying, I'm glad you're here. Kigo smiled. He was very good at nice, easygoing smiles. Looking at ease had always helped him feel at ease. So, as he looked at Izuku, he smiled. There was a comfortable silence for a few minutes as the two enjoyed one another's presence. After a while, Izuku broke it by asking, face suddenly tinged with concern, how has work been? Kigo made sure not to frown. Fine, he said. And it was. Nothing particularly notable has happened in a while. I don't think I'll be cracking the top 2 anytime soon, that's for sure. Those 2 guys have sat in those places for years now, and I don't think anyone's taking their place until they leave it voluntarily. Luckily, that doesn't seem to upset the suits. I wouldn't want to be number 1 or 2 anyway. Izuku hung onto every word. It was so rare he got to talk to Kigo these days, he had to savor every conversation. Actually, the suits are starting to cause a bit of a fuss about Endeavor. I don't know why, but they keep reminding him how close he is to retirement age. I think they're threatening to force him to retire as soon as he's old enough. I just can't figure out why. Izuku's face twisted in thought. The HPSC had been talking about revitalizing the hero image for a while now. Maybe they don't like his open aggression? Kigo shook his head. No, I don't think that's it. The revitalization that they're talking about, while it does promote the kind of image All Might has, is more lean towards the marketability of a hero. Endeavor has more than enough merch to sate their needs in that category. Izuku pursed his lips. He wondered. It doesn't make sense. His son just got into UA. In a couple of years, the two will have the opportunity to work together before he goes solo. I'm sure the father-son image would rake in money really fast. Kigo shrugged. I dunno. It's not my job to question the suits. I just hope I get the chance to work with him more closely before that happens. Izuku giggled. I still can't believe you think Endeavor is better than All Might. Hey, what can I say? He is the only hero to have looked at the ideal that is the symbol of peace and thought, I'm going to be better than that. You have to admit, that's pretty cool. Izuku pondered it, but not for long. This was a conversation they had had before. It was old to the point it felt scripted, and it was comfortable in its many rehearsals. Maybe, but he's gone about it all the wrong way. If he wants to surpass All Might, he has to be more caring and open. He's so aloof that he's almost rude to the people he saves. Kigo openly laughed at that. He's not going to beat All Might at his own game. All Might's whole thing is saving people with a smile. Endeavor can't top that. The only way he's gonna surpass All Might in hero rankings is by not only being better, but by being different. If he tried to follow in the symbol of peace's footsteps, he'd be written off as a wannabe, and he never would have made it as far as he did. Copies are rarely as good as the original, forget being considered any better. Izuku shook his head vehemently, but before he opened his mouth to speak, he winced and grabbed at his head. Another headache? Kigo asked. His voice was low and soft. Izuku nodded, gently. The two waited patiently and quietly for it to pass. In the silence, which lasted several minutes, Izuku's face darkened, his mind finally settling on memories of the disastrous field trip. Izuku spoke first. They wanted to kill All Might, but he wasn't there. So they tried to settle for his students, he whispered. Kigo's face didn't change, but his grip on his armrests tightened. Izuku could see his white knuckles out of the corner of his eye. They had this thing. I know mutation quirks can get crazy, but this was... I don't have words to describe it. And it was so powerful. It had insane speed and strength. It could regrow limbs. Could take a hit. From All Might like it was nothing. Kigo blanched. How could this have happened? Wasn't UA security supposed to be the best in the world? Izuku. I had so much fire and it barely seemed to care. It just ran right at me and held me down. I thought I was going to die. Izuku's voice choked at the end. Kigo listened closely, positioning himself at the foot of his bed. Izuku didn't try to pull away. Tears were starting to form on his face and he kept wiping at them furiously, trying to hide them. Izuku, it's okay to cry. You're safe now. Izuku shook his head violently, ignoring the pain that exploded throughout his skull in retaliation. "It's not allowed," he whispered. Kigo frowned. "They won't know," he replied. Izuku hesitated a moment before he sobbed, sitting up and leaning forward into Kigo's shoulder. Kigo held him in a tight hug. Neither of them particularly liked hugs. They were confining and left them feeling vulnerable. But there were times like this, when they were at their lowest, where they needed one as desperately as a fish needed water. They stayed like that for a while until Izuku eventually fell back asleep and Kigo had to go back to work.